Chapter 100. There's an activity for decisive heroes to find the most satisfying chapters. For details, see the chapters related to the novel and the top post in the book review section. The time limit is 2 weeks. The strange figure in bright red armor was like a divine soldier. He stood in the middle of the path without holding any weapons. The thick helmet seemed to cover his entire face. In the pouring rain, the strong armored figure was surrounded by fog. Judo Taoist Mi Wei Shuyang cried out in shock. The Southern Kingdom's talisman General Red Armor has long been dead. It's said that he tried to assassinate the late emperor. He was stripped of his armor and skin by the eunuch who scolded him as a human cat. His corpse and armor were hung on a royal flag. Many Jianghu people who went there in admiration saw the bloody scene with their own eyes. That bright red armor was unique in the world, and it was confirmed by Chao Guanzi. It can't be faked. What's up with this red armor figure? The caravan had stopped. Xu Xiao and Yang Qingfeng rode their horses to Lu Qiantong's side, looking nervous. The 3 secret manuals were not easy to obtain. Most of the assassins who dared to provoke His Royal Highness were powerful. Moreover, the person in front of them had appeared openly on the road. Just his courage alone made the 3 of them feel inferior. The ups and downs of the political world were a test of one's ability to observe people's expressions. In Jianghu, one had to observe each other's temperament. The biggest taboo was to make a mistake. Otherwise, no matter how powerful one was, there would be a day when they would fail miserably. Didn't the sword godly Chun Gang, a peerless master in the mystic understanding realm, lose to Wang Xianji, who was just a newborn calf at that time? To be more specific, Wu Luding, the young swordsman who appeared in the Wu family sword tomb, never said who he was or where he came from. He only headed south, killing with his sword. Those who died to his one-handed, withered sword were unlucky people who often got their shoes wet while walking by the river. Su Fengyin was not anxious. He only stared at the talisman General Red Armor figure with wide eyes. He asked with interest, "Grandpa Wei, what is this talisman General Red Armor figure? Does it look extra ferocious just by wearing red armor? Then I'll have to get one to wear." 9 Bushels old Taoist me smiled bitterly. "Your Highness, this isn't something you can wear casually." Back then, the origins of the red armor were unknown. There are only some rumors saying that it was an ancient armor from the Taoist master manor of Mount Longhu. Mount Longhu had been passed down for a few generations, and a few Taoist masters had drawn talismans on it. It was probably a Taoist immortal weapon used to suppress evil spirits. However, it somehow ended up in the Jianghu. First, it was obtained by the heavenly secret sect of the Xianxia Academy. After doing all sorts of strange things to it, Mount Longhu almost fought with the Xianxia Academy because of it. When it reappeared in the Jianghu, it was draped over the body of the red-armored man, making it invulnerable to weapons and invulnerable to fire and water. However, the armored man was like a walking corpse. Dying in the hands of the great official Han Xianxian was not necessarily a kind of release. The talisman red-armored man in front of us seems to be slightly different from the rumors. He waved his hand to reject Blue Bird's offer of an umbrella and called the 6-year phoenix to his arm. At this moment, Su Fengyin, who was drenched like a drowned rat, was still in the mood to tease the green and white lawn. He jokingly said, "Perhaps they're the children of the talisman General Red Armored Man from back then. Since the older one is a talisman general, then let's call the younger one a talisman soldier. Grandpa Wei, what do you think?" Wei Shuyang's 3 strands of white beard had turned into 3 small braids after being soaked in water. When he reached out to touch it again, he naturally couldn't feel the demeanor of an immortal anymore. He awkwardly withdrew his hand and slowly said, "Your Highness's way of saying things is really unconstrained." Su Fengyin smiled mischievously and said, "Grandpa Wei, your flattery is really something." The old man and the young man laughed heartily, subtly dispelling the monstrous killing intent at the end of the path. Su Fengyin narrowed his eyes and said softly, "Lu Qiantong's red cloud sword, Xu Xiao's embracing simplicity spell, and Yang Qingfeng's art of controlling ghosts. I want to see if these 3 people are qualified to make it to the martial emperor city alive." The old Taoist seemed to have not heard this ruthless sentence. He rode forward on his horse and was a dozen steps away from the carriage. With a shake of his sleeves, the rein above his head bounced away as if it had hit an iron plate. Lu Qiantang pulled out his sword and stopped the horse. After waiting for Xu Xiao and Yang Qingfeng to catch up, he spurred his horse and rushed forward. From a moment, he picked up the crouching dragon mount sword controlling technique on the 5th floor of the tide-listening pavilion. He knew that he would have to risk his life today. It was just that it was much earlier than expected, but so what? If one wanted to learn how to control a sword, one had to use a strong opponent as a whetstone to sharpen one's sword heart to an incomparably pure level. Only then could one have a chance to obtain the essence of swordsmanship. As the old god of swords Li Chungang said, "Open your mouth and spit out a magnificent sword aura, slashing out a vast field of stars." There were more than 100,000 young wanderers in the world who wanted to learn swordsmanship. Who didn't want to slash out with a sword that even ghosts, immortals, and Buddhas couldn't match? Lu Qiantang's figure was already very tall and sturdy, and the horse he was riding was even more rare. For a moment, the small path was trampled by the horse's hooves, causing mud to splash everywhere. One man and one horse were unstoppable, perhaps because the swordsman L.V. Qiantang had aroused his killing intent. Even Xu Xiong, who only knew how to moan on the bed, gave a heavy snort. Amidst the muffled sound of the heavy rain hitting the small path, it was particularly ear-piercing. Yang Qingfeng, who didn't need to hold the reins, could still control the horse's running speed to perfection. She slowly bent down and placed her snow-white hands on the horse's neck. The empty-handed, red-armored men of the southern kingdom stood still and let the 3 people and 3 horses charge forward. Through the dense curtain of rain, Lu Qiantang could almost see the cloud seal Sanskrit on the red armor. It was actually written in both Buddhism and Taoism. With just a glance, he felt the qi in his chest stagnate. Suppressing the distracting thoughts in his mind, he let out an angry roar and spat out the murky air in his heart. Borrowing the momentum of the galloping horse, he slashed out with a domineering sword strike. The curtain of rain was instantly torn apart. Unfortunately, the raindrops that came into contact with this huge sword seemed to have dripped onto a piece of hot iron. With a sizzling sound, they turned into a puff of smoke. The huge puppet, which was similar to the rumored red-armored man, stiffly but quickly raised one of its hands. Its 5 fingers, which were wrapped in red armor like its face, opened up and tried to grasp Lu Qiantang's sword strike that contained the essence, energy, spirit, and will of the most powerful sword strike in his life. As the red cloud sword and the red-armored man's 5 fingers brushed past each other, a series of sparks flew out. The red-armored man failed to grasp the sword, and Lu Qiantang, who was already famous in the southern Tang country at the age of 30, also failed to grasp the sword strike. Lu Qiantang took full advantage of the time and place to slash out this sword strike, but the red-armored man only stood still and gently raised his hand to resolve everything. Xu Xiao was surprised to see that Yang Qingfeng had sped up and rushed out. She actually wanted to use the horse to violently collide with the red-armored man. In the blink of an eye, Lu Qiantang and the red-armored man exchanged blows. Chapter 101. Yang Qingfeng, who had her hands on the horse's neck, suddenly jumped up. The horse, whose eyes were filled with blood, charged at the red-armored man as if it had gone mad. First, there was a loud boom. Then, even Su Fingyan, who was far away, heard the sound of bones breaking inch by inch, as if the horse had crashed into a mountain. The red-armored man didn't move an inch. The horse's head and neck had been broken, and it had died in front of him. Xu Xiao didn't care how powerful the red-armored man was, and she couldn't care less about the fear in her heart. She dismounted from the horse and leaped forward like a rabbit. She placed her white palms on the armor on the monster's chest and suddenly exerted her strength. With her and the monster as the center, countless raindrops exploded in the air. Xu Xiao's strength was, after all, vigorous internal energy. The red-armored man finally swayed a little. No matter if it moved an inch or a foot, as long as it moved, even if it didn't fall down, it was still 1,000,000 times better than not moving at all. Shu Xiao's attack hit its target, and she used the force to bounce back. Her feet drew a straight line in the mud, and the hem of her skirt was covered in mud. Lu Qiantang, who was behind the red-armored man, continued to charge forward with his horse. He fiercely pulled the reins, raised the horse's hooves, and stomped heavily on the ground, creating 2 holes in the muddy road. Lu Qiantang turned his horse around and took a deep breath. His expression was incomparably solemn. Yang Qingfeng, who had floated between Lu Qiantang and the red-armored man, was still expressionless. However, her hands were even paler, and the veins on the back of her hands were almost visible. The number of veins on her hands was much denser than that of a normal person's. The 3 of them, working together, only managed to make this strange armored man sway a little. Wei Shuyang muttered to himself. Fortunately, we can confirm that this isn't the red-armored man from the 4 great grandmasters. Could it be that His Royal Highness was right, and it's just an imitation? Su Fengyan shouted, Grandpa Wei, go and stop Ningame and the Phoenix Battalion. Leave this to the 3 of them. The old Taoist priest, who was about to lend a hand, was stunned for a moment before he left. Su Fengyan lightly squeezed the horse's belly and came to the side of the carriage. Blue Bird, who was driving the carriage, held a delicate oil paper umbrella. It was the only graceful scene in this murderous, muddy path. Su Fengyan clicked his tongue and said, As expected, only a battle to the death can reveal the true colors of an expert. Lu Qiantang's sword move is really at the peak of sword moves. Yang Qingfeng's trick only looks good, but it's nothing special. I really underestimated that woman Shu Xiao. Bluebird nodded and asked a very important question. Your Highness, is there only one armored person? If the Phoenix Battalion doesn't come, wouldn't it be inappropriate? Su Fengyan smiled and said, How could there only be one talisman general red-armored puppet? Maybe there's a second or third one hiding in the dense forest. Maybe there are 4 or 5 of them altogether. Because I calculated that 2 red-armored puppets can easily get rid of Lu Qianang and the other 2, and 1 red-armored puppet can get rid of 100 Phoenix Battalion. Even with the halberd Ning Ame holding the line, both sides will probably suffer. If another one comes, wouldn't we have to personally go into battle? The person in the carriage is a top secret. Even I don't know his identity. No matter how resourceful the red-armored puppet's master is, he wouldn't be able to guess it. Therefore, with a snap of his fingers, the remaining red-armored puppet and the expert behind the scenes would be able to easily take my head. If it's really as I think, without the old man in the sheepskin fur coat, then I'll be in trouble. Even if you are the kamikaze warrior 3rd, that Su Xiao painstakingly cultivated and can fight to the death with a puppet, you may not be able to guarantee that I will reach Yingzhou alive. Bluebird looked at the calm face of His Royal Highness. She lowered her head and said softly, It's Bluebird who is useless. Su Fengyan shook his head and smiled. To me, it's not that a useless person isn't an expert. It's that they aren't willing to give their life to me. Haha, Bluebird, raise your head. I like to see your cold and elegant appearance. Compared to those heroines who don't live up to their titles, you are much more beautiful and moving. Bluebird's face reddened. Su Fengyan looked at the hostile battlefield. With a shake of his arm, he released Qing Bailuan. His hands pressed down on Xiao Dong and Spring Thunder respectively. He smiled nastily. Although this is the worst-case scenario, with my status, I reckon it's worth it for them to treat me so seriously. Motherf asterisk Kerr, 5 puppets. Are they going to play a game of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth? The curtain behind Bluebird lifted up a corner. 2 heads popped out, one above and one below. Jiang and I didn't say anything. He just stared with his eyes wide open. The old man pulled out the sandalwood from his hairbun. Instead, he inserted something that Su Fengyan couldn't think of. Divine talisman. What were these 2 clowns doing? The old man squinted his eyes and smiled. Boy, your brain is really not bad. Your 3 useless subordinates are up against the water armor of the red armor talisman. Look at the weather. If you don't throw them out to calm the situation, wouldn't it be a waste of your status? This old man kindly reminded you that the earth armor talisman might come out from under your horse's belly and tear you in half. The fire armor talisman is standing on a hillside 600 steps northeast of you. The wood armor talisman is squatting on a tree 300 steps southwest of you. As for the gold armor talisman, did he not come? Or was his presence concealed by an expert? Or did he go to cause trouble for your Phoenix Battalion's light cavalry? You really make this old man worry. Why don't you give me a straightforward answer? The little girl, and I will go back to Xianxia. Fighting and killing is boring. At most, we'll call someone to help you collect your corpse. Su Fengyin smiled. Then let me guess. Su Xiao, and you have 3 rules. Did he mention that you are not allowed to touch weapons? The old man opened his eyes wide and stretched out his single arm to show his innocence. Kid, what does this old man have in his hand? Su Fengyin stretched out a hand. Give the talisman to me for safekeeping. Jiang and I loudly protested. That's mine. Mine. Su Fengyin ignored this naive little clay figurine and only stared at the old man. The old man shook his head. Forget it. Remember, this old man didn't make a move for you. It's for the little girl. Su Fengyin smiled and retracted his hand. His meaning couldn't be more obvious. Jiang and I was so angry that his cheeks puffed up. He couldn't wait to take back the talisman and stab that cunning fox's face 100 times. In a trance, the old man had already bent over and walked out of the carriage unhurriedly. He stretched out his finger and flicked. Pa! A drop of water was flicked and floated away. Su Fengyin suddenly turned his head and followed this unremarkable drop of water to the end of the path. 1 drop, 2 drops, 10 drops, hundreds and thousands of drops, connected into a line, converged into a sword. From Su Fengyin's side, it went straight to the chest of the red-armored talisman general. The water sword lightly pierced through that undefeatable talisman, General Water-Armored Talisman General. The sword energy that filled the sky burst apart. That puppet collapsed with a loud bang. Su Fengyin was dumbstruck and quickly closed his eyes. Between heaven and earth, everything returned to silence. Su Fengyin repeatedly imagined the trajectory of the sword energy that was like an azure dragon emerging from water. Water sword against water armor. Grandpa Wei, you said that grade 1 had 4 levels. Above Vidra was Xian. It turned out that a flick of Xian was Xian. Chapter 102. Shu Xian stood dumbstruck, not daring to move. This water sword just happened to shoot over the top of her head, messing up her fine black hair. The purple silk handkerchief that was used to stabilize her hair bun fell into the mud. Her body, which was wrapped around her exquisite figure, fluttered forward. The water sword formed a thin line, but it contained an astonishing sword aura. Shu Xiu's ears rumbled for a long time. The pale-faced Shu Xiu, who did not use a sword, was already so shocked. Lu Qiantang, who had studied the way of the sword for 30 years, opened his mouth slightly. The superior sword was always the way of the sword, not the art of the sword. The majestic and weak sword aura had no direct relationship with the size of the sword aura. The old man on the horse carriage's finger was indeed very similar to the tide of the Guangling River in his hometown. Every year on the 18th day of the 8th lunar month, the spectacular scene was unparalleled in the world. Lu Qiantang had built a thatched cottage near the sea salt pavilion on the Guangling River, which was the most suitable place to admire the midnight tide of 100,000 soldiers. Lu Qiantang looked at the horse carriage. The figure of the old man with the sheepskin fur coat was blurry. He muttered in his heart. Among the 6 guards of the martial library, he had never heard of a grandmaster of the way of the sword with such a tyrannical sword aura. Lu Qiantang pondered, but he still did not dare to lower his guard. Together with Yang Qingfeng, he stared fixedly at the red-armored man who had fallen to the ground. Lu Qiantang discovered that the hands of this weak, middle-aged man were bleeding. At some point in time, he had drawn a talisman with blood on the back of his hands, which the heavy rain could not wash away. As for whether it was the talisman of the Longhu Taoist master or the Maoshan exorcism spell, Lu Qiantang was not proficient in this field, so he could not be sure. Yang Qingfeng squatted on the ground, his 10 fingers digging into the mud. The mud immediately began to churn. What was even more surprising was that more than 10 silver-white mole crickets broke out of Yang Qingfeng's withered flesh. Su Fengnian frowned and asked, "Is this water armor dead?" The old man, with a divine talisman pinned on his hair bun, took the oil paper umbrella from Bluebird's hands and sneered, "It's easier said than done. Although these 5 red talisman armors are much weaker than Yi Hongting's yellow and purple fade armor, how can they be killed with just a finger?" Back then, when Yi Hongting fought against enemies in the Vajra realm, she would always be pestered to death for a few days and nights. Unless she was stripped of her armor and skin like Han Xianxia, no matter how severely she was injured or killed, Yi Hongting wouldn't feel any pain or itch. Condensing yellow and purple fate into armor is a great creation, divine art. Now that the red armor is made according to the 5 elements, the 5 elements talisman will gather the red armor, and that will be the beginning of the show. Since this old man has made a move, he doesn't mind helping the Buddha to the west. No matter how difficult it is to deal with him, he is still not as disgusting as Yi Hongting. Found it. The old man looked towards the east. Bluebird's figure shot out. Since you're hiding and not willing to come out, this old man will break one armor first. Let's see if you still have the patience. The 5 elements lack water. Let's see how you guys are best at grinding. The old man only took one step, and the umbrella swept over Shu Xiu's head. He stepped down and stepped on the chest of the talisman general who was about to get up. It was exactly where the water droplet's sword had exploded. Lu Qiantong's crimson afterglow sword and Yang Qingfeng's art of recuperation and exorcism were sent flying by the old man's move. It would be an understatement to say that he was unreasonable. However, Lu Qiantong and Yang Qingfeng didn't reveal the slightest bit of resentment. Instead, they took advantage of the situation to retreat. The old man with the umbrella stepped again and again, and the head of the water armor was stepped into the deep, muddy pit. Not only that, he instantly closed the umbrella and used it as a sword. This time, compared to the Azure Dragon water sword formed by the water droplets, the sword intent was even more boundless. The rain that filled the sky was wrapped by this umbrella, forming a huge rain tornado around the old man. The old man who used the umbrella as a sword whispered, "One sword immortal kneels." The umbrella and the tornado pierced the head of the talisman general like the Milky Way. The pouring rain on the small path suddenly stopped. The raindrops didn't fall, but instead bounced back up, as if someone had used human strength to go against the heavenly Tao and forcefully stopped it. A soft slap sounded. The old man opened the oil paper umbrella again and slowly walked back to the carriage. Bluebird lightly returned, shook her head, and said, "The enemy retreated." Su Fengnian, who was sitting on the horse, still closed his eyes and concentrated. This should be a sword that only the land immortals can use, right? It was indeed correct that he didn't practice the sword first when he practiced the saber. If he had learned the sword earlier, and then witnessed today's finger and Xian swords, he would definitely have been traumatized and couldn't get rid of it. Although there was still a gap between him and the sword heart, sword chi, and sword intent, he probably wouldn't have the courage and confidence to use the sword again. In the battle between the saber and the sword, if one were to talk about the number of first-class masters, the two sides were about the same. But if one were to talk about the small group of people at the top, if one were to pick out a single person to fight, the Grandmaster of the sword would firmly suppress the Master of the saber. Especially the immortals who were known as the sword god in the past generations in Jianghu. Which one of them wasn't a master who had almost reached the peak of martial arts? In the previous generation, Li Chungang was invincible with his wooden horse ox. In this generation, the number 1 swordsman, Dong Tai, even fooled around with a peach blossom, and no one dared to fight with him. Chao Guanzi, who was arrogant and domineering, also claimed that he was worthy of being above the 8 of them, but he was ashamed to be right behind Dong Tai. These words drew a clear line between Wang Xinji and Dong Tai and the other 8 masters, including Chao Guanzi. No matter how Wang Xinji was, the people of Jianghu had long regarded her as a person of the immortal realm in Tiange, but she was just a weirdo that appeared once in 500 years. Dong Tai was different. After all, he was tainted with some people's aura. The peach blossom sword god was a legend that even people in the palace missed. Su Fengyin asked softly, "The water armor is dead? The person behind the scenes has retreated?" The old man, who had shown off 2 moves without using a sword, was very arrogant. He ignored his royal highness and only smiled at Jiang and I, who actually did not see anything clearly. He asked, "Little girl, this old man still has some courage left, right?" Jiang and I only vaguely saw the torrential rain tornado, but she was a little far away. In addition, the layman only knew how to watch the show, so her degree of shock was far less than Lu Qiantang, Xu Xiao, and the others. Moreover, she was someone who had seen the world. In the past, Bai Hu Er's face was much more beautiful when she used 2 blades to sweep the wind and snow. The blades were beautiful, and the person was even more beautiful. Therefore, when the old god of swords made his move this time, he probably wouldn't be able to escape the fate of winking at a blind person. Seeing the little girl's confused expression, Li Chungang laughed out loud and reached out to touch the divine talisman. He was in a good mood. In the years when the wooden horse ox hadn't stopped, he was really tired of hearing flattery and gasps of cold air. It wasn't as comfortable as the little girl's confused expression. The old man handed the oil paper umbrella back to Bluebird. When he got into the carriage, he said casually, "The other side probably did not want to fight to the death with you, so they were willing to leave behind a water armor. If you move faster, you can still see some of the mysteries of this red talisman armor. If the puppet in the armor dies, the knowledge of the talisman writing on the red talisman armor will also be gone." Su Fengyin's expression was complicated. After a moment of hesitation, he bowed to the old man and urged his horse to the place where the wooden armor had been killed by the umbrella sword. Waving his hand to drive away Lu Qiantang and Yang Qingfeng, His Royal Highness squatted in front of the red talisman armor. The armor on the red talisman armor's head had already been shattered by the sword, but the characters and patterns carved on the red armor were exquisite beyond compare. What was Su Fengyin most proud of? Naturally, it was not his fledgling blade skills, but his memory. The red armor had been carved with the 3 pure talismans of Taoism and Sanskrit incantations of Buddhism. Su Fengyin could only understand half of it. This was attributed to him being a Buddhist follower of Wang Fei's mother. In addition, he had often heard Wei Shuyang talk about the grudges between the 3 Taoist talisman schools. Xu Xiao gathered her courage and wanted to shield his royal highness from the rain, but Su Fengyin, who was facing the red armor, coldly said, "Get lost." Xu Xiao's expression froze. The corner of Big Sword Lu Qiantang's mouth twitched slightly. Yang Qingfeng walked to a suitable distance away from his royal highness and the red armor talisman armor. He respectfully said, "His Royal Highness, this lowly one knows a little about talisman mechanisms. Can I take a closer look?" Su Fengyin did not raise his head. He only asked stiffly, "Can you preserve your soul for a little longer?" Yang Qingfeng bowed slightly and said confidently, "Yes. Don't disappoint me." Su Fengyin pulled out the spring thunder saber and lifted one of the red armor talisman's arms. He carefully examined every detail of the red armor talisman's arm. The red armor talisman's chest had been blasted open by the old man's finger. Most of it could no longer be distinguished, but the red armor talisman's arms and legs were intact. Chapter 103. Yang Qingfeng carefully squatted down. After a moment of surprise, he forced a smile and said, "His Royal Highness, this armored man seems to have been dead for a long time." Su Fengyin's movements on the corpse were as smooth as flowing water. He wasn't the slightest bit frightened by Yang Qingfeng's revelation. He frowned and said, "Seems?" Yang Qingfeng's heart skipped a beat. He said in a deep voice, "I'm sure." Su Fengyin didn't linger on this topic. He asked, "What clues do you have?" Yang Qingfeng stared at the red-armored man and said slowly, "As expected, most of the talismans came from Mount Longhu's Celestial Master sect. As the saying goes, water doesn't lie in its depth. The talismans of the Celestial Master sect are different from the talismans of Mount Gazao. Mount Longhu doesn't care if the talismans have a proper form. Your Highness the Crown Prince, look at the cloud pattern on the ancient seal script on your arm. This is Mount Longhu's most famous cloud seal. There are as many as 7 layers, but it's a pity that it's not the same as the 8 layers of purple cloud seal of the underworld. As for the most difficult 9 layers heavenly book, it only exists in the annals of Mount Longhu's history. This 9 palaces talisman is different. It comes from Mount Guzao's spiritual treasure, mountain, moving scripture. The difference can also be seen in the way the Qi practitioners use the brush. As for the image of the heavenly venerate on the left leg, it's unmistakably a Maoshan talisman. Its form is excellent, only a step away from the immortal grade. As for the Sanskrit scriptures, I don't dare to say anything, but I think there must be traces of the heavenly secret tower of the Xianxia Academy. Su Fengyin knocked on the armor with the spring lightning. The sound was crisp and clear. He pierced it with the tip of his saber, but there was no trace. He asked, "What is the material of this red armor?" Yang Qingfeng shook his head and said, "I don't know. This is the first time I've seen it." The corpse in the red armor gradually turned into ashes, and then it was beaten into the mud by the raindrops. As the old man said, the knowledge of the armor faded away, and in the end, only an incomplete armor was left. Su Fengyin stood up and put away the spring thunder saber. Just then, Wei Shuyang and Ning Amei dismounted from their horses. Su Fengyin noticed that Ning Amei's hand, which was holding the halberd, was bleeding profusely. There were only a few short halberds left in his backpack. This Wu Dian general knelt heavily in the mud and shouted with bloodshot eyes, "This general is incompetent. The Phoenix Battalion has lost more than 40 men, but we still couldn't stop that red-armored man. We only managed to cut off one of his arms." Ningame only asked His Royal Highness to give this general 30 light cavalry to pursue and kill. "If you can't take down that assassin, Ningame will bring his head to me," Su Fengyin asked in surprise. General Ning cut off one of the armored man's arms. To the side, Wei Shuyang nodded gently. It was truly a bloody battle. Although the Phoenix Battalion was composed of light cavalry, no one was afraid of death or injury when faced with the unfathomable red-armored man. Especially with the battle formation that had been honed over the years, they displayed a strength that was beyond Wei Shuyang's imagination. Ning Amei took the lead, his iron halberd sweeping away thousands of troops. In addition, the short halberd on his back whistled like the wind every time it was thrown. Yet, Ning Amei had actually cut off one of the red-armored man's arms. Even though Wei Shuyang was a Taoist, he was still in Jianghu. In the past, it was inevitable that he had underestimated the martial artists on the battlefield. Today, after seeing it with his own eyes, he realized how invincible it was when the martial artists and valiant soldiers gathered together in a battle formation. Su Fengyin smiled and said calmly, "General Ning, you can bring the Phoenix Battalion back to Bailiang. I don't need you to worry about me anymore. How can Bailiang's elite be lost in Jianghu?" The burly Ningame lowered his head and stuck the halberd in his hand into the ground. He gritted his teeth and said, "Ningame is not willing. The Phoenix Battalion is not willing." Su Fengyin said expressionlessly, "Are they not afraid of death?" Ningame said in a deep voice, "When have the Bailiang cavalry ever been afraid of death? They only know how to seek death in battle." Su Fengyin mounted the white horse and said indifferently, "Then follow. Ningame, send the dead soldiers back to the cold land first. I will slow down and wait for you." Ningame drew his halberd and left to carry out the order. The heavy rain continued to pour from the pitch-black sky to the earth without spending any money. The cavalry calmed down. Ningame went back to deal with the funeral arrangements. Lu Qianeng carried the red trophy armor on his back. Shu Xiu sat on the horse in a daze. Yang Qingfeng, who had always been a loner since childhood, had a rare smile on his old-fashioned face. This made Shu Xiu, who was riding side by side, come back to her senses and see it. When she saw it, she felt more and more depressed. Su Fengyin said self-deprecatingly, "The Phoenix Battalion, for whom are they seeking death?" 30 li out of the city, braving the rain to welcome Bailiang's second great noble. The officials of the Yingyu Battalion, in their anxiety and fear, only waited until the courier sent a message that made them look at each other in dismay. His Royal Highness had already taken a shortcut and arrived at the city gate. Zheng Hanhai smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said to Jean Lanting, "Let's go." The deputy captain of the Dongjin battalion, Tang Yinshan, spat on the ground. He walked out of the pavilion and said angrily, "Let's go back to the city." Su Fengyan was led by the humble and fearful officials of the city to the elegant scholar Jean Lanting's private residence. It occupied a large area and had a deep courtyard. He raised geese, planted lotuses, and planted bananas. It was indeed a peaceful place with pleasant scenery. It was fortunate that the Little Yingyu battalion could find such a good place with good feng shui. From beginning to end, the officials of the Yingyu battalion did not dare to say a word. It was no wonder that he was afraid of his Royal Highness like a wolf, a tiger, or a leopard. In the imperial court, there was a world of difference between officials. There were countless thresholds for officials. The 6th rank was a threshold, and the 3rd rank was another big threshold. Other than the officials of the border who held great power, those below the 3rd rank were just small carps that had not made the great leap. They were just slightly fatter than the other fish and shrimp. Only by wearing the 3rd rank peacock or tiger or leopard official robes could one be considered to have achieved success as an official. If one was a civil official, being able to exchange the 3rd rank peacock patch for a 2nd rank golden pheasant, and finally for a 1st rank red-crowned crane, this was bringing honor to one's ancestors. Su Fengyan changed into a new set of clothes in his room. Bluebird helped him comb his hair. Su Fengyan took out the Yugong Geography Journal and laid it out on the table. He pointed at a few provinces and counties and said with a smile, "Look, the Yong and Quan provinces that border Bailiang. There are more than 10 people with real power. Regardless of whether they're civil or military officials, they all harbor enmity towards Su Shao. 1/3 of Great General Gu Jiantang's former subordinates are stationed in these 2 provinces. Within the borders of Yong province, I'm afraid that other than this Yingyu battalion, we won't be able to see any good faces. However, once we leave Yong province, the situation will take a turn for the better. In the past 2 years, Lu Qiu'er has bribed some of the old generals of Bailiang to hold power in the provinces and counties. When the time comes, it will be inevitable that there will be a few toasts. Perhaps there will be countless concubines, and beautiful maids will fight to warm my bed." Thinking back to the time when I was with old Huang in the middle of Yong province, I was robbed and lost my horse. In Ji province, I can't be mentioned in the same breath. Bluebird looked out the window and said, "Jiang and I is holding a book and holding an umbrella in the courtyard while waiting." Su Fengyan said with a smile, "She only has money in her eyes. Let her in." Bluebird led Jiang and I into the room. Su Fengyan pointed to a bag on the table that Bluebird was in charge of. He instructed Jiang and I, "Don't be in a hurry to read. Grind the ink first. I want to draw something." There was good quality rice paper in the room, but Su Fengyan was very good at writing. Jiang and I opened the bag and picked out a Guangdong Liao Wei. However, when she saw the extremely familiar fire clay ancient inkstone on Mount Wudong, Jiang and I had already thrown this ancient inkstone, which was ranked 2nd by West Chu's imperial uncle, Jiang Taiya, into the elephant washing pool. How did it appear again? Jiang and I carefully examined and stroked it. She flipped through the bottom of the ancient inkstone and saw that it was indeed West Chu's million halberd warriors who can compete. Jiang and I used all her strength to hold the ancient inkstone that was warm in winter and cool in summer. She couldn't bear to use it to smash His Royal Highness, who was treacherous and shameless. She could only curse with reddened eyes. "What's going on?" Su Fengyan said with a smile. "I gave it to you, but you threw it away. I'm a stingy person, so I went to the bottom of the elephant washing pool to pick it up." Jiang Ni's eyes were moist and her lips trembled. Su Fengyan imitated her tone perfectly. "The divine talisman is mine. Mine. The fire clay ancient inkstone is mine. It's still mine." Jiang and I pounced on this bastard and shouted with a crying voice, "I'll kill you." Su Fengyan turned his head to look at the Yugong geography record. He stretched out a leg to block the charging clay figurine and said softly, "All right, stop fooling around. Take this ancient inkstone as a gift." Jiang and I cried with resentment. It was originally mine. You scoundrel. I'm going to learn the sword from Li Chungang and stab you to death. Su Fingyin narrowed his eyes and fell in a deep thought. Su Fingyin couldn't care less about the fact that he hadn't learned the sword art yet and could only use the ancient inkstone to smash the clay figurine on his knee. He clicked his tongue and said, Li Chungang, this old man's conduct really doesn't look like a sword god. Chapter 104. That old man with the sheepskin fur coat was the previous generation's god of swords, Li Chungang. From Su Fingyin's point of view, this was unexpected but reasonable. Thinking of Su Zhao's evaluation in the tide-listening pavilion, plus the string of water swords and the umbrella sword were still vivid in his mind. It was all extremely shocking. Su Fingyin believed that Jiangni's mouth was without filter. It was best if it was Li Chungang. No matter how thin Old Crane was, it was not comparable to chickens and ducks on the ground. So what if he lost to Wang Xinji and had his wooden horse broken? This one-armed old man was still able to break the red armor with a single finger. If he was given a sharp sword, what kind of sword will he have? One of Su Fingyin's legs was smashed by Jiangni's priceless fire clay, inkstone, no less than 100 times. He frowned and said, If you continue smashing my legs will be fine, but your uncle Jiang Tai's treasure will be destroyed. Even if you don't feel bad, I do. Jiang and I vented most of her anger and carefully hid the ancient inkstone. Actually, where could she hide it? Su Fingyin picked up a stack of cooked rice paper from the table. He was a little surprised. It was actually comparable to the Gangnam Du's tribute, de Xianxia. He pulled out a thin piece of rice paper and shook it. It was as thin as an egg membrane, but surprisingly tough. Su Fingyin was in a good mood. He even had the thought of asking the owner of the house for a few dozen pieces of rice paper before he left. Thus, Su Fingyin didn't care if there was a fire clay inkstone or not. He personally grinded a natural, toad-shaped yellow inkstone on the table. He took the Guangdong Liaowei and set Jiang and I aside. Relying on his memory, he meticulously drew the mysterious pattern on the red armored man's armor. He used 4 pieces of rice paper on the red armored man's chest, back, hands, and feet. Then he gradually separated the cloud seal heavenly script that was covered with multiple layers and drew it on a single page. Clouds swirled around, the star map was obscure, and there were many Buddhist Sanskrit words. It was truly an endless physical labor. Su Fingyin put his heart and soul into drawing these things. It was several times more strenuous than practicing with a knife. Unknowingly, the rain outside the window had long disappeared. Su Fingyin rubbed his eyes. His hands were covered in ink. Bluebird gently walked into the room and handed over a hot towel. Su Fingyin wiped his face and hands. He looked tired. This work was too tiring. He was afraid that a single stroke would make a mistake. Bluebird faintly said, Your Highness, those people outside the courtyard have been chased away by this servant. Su Fingyin let out a long breath. One of his hands subconsciously stroked the embroidered winter saber that was close at hand. He gently nodded and said, I'm busy right now. How can I have the mood to talk nonsense with them? If I think of something and don't have time to write it down, they might lose their official positions and jobs on the same day. Bluebird, go and find out who the owner of this house is. Just by looking at it, the calligraphy, paintings, bronzes, steels, and name papers are not small. It's not something that can be displayed by an ordinary wealthy family. While you're at it, go and ask the table how many of these embroidered Xian scrolls are in stock. I want 50 to 60 pieces of embroidered Xian scrolls for use on the road. Bluebird nodded and left. From the corner of his eyes, Su Fingyin noticed that Jiang In-I was tiptoeing and secretly peeking at the things he had drawn. He was too lazy to expose her. He would just treat it as repaying this lass for revealing his secret. Divine Swordsman and Wooden Horse Ox. When Su Fingyin remembered these 2 names, he could not help but associate them with those 2 swords. Su Fingyin stretched his neck. He picked up the embroidered winter saber and spring thunder saber and went to the courtyard. Jiang In-I held the secret manual and stood in the corridor. She was unwilling to leave. 1 copper coin per word. Today, she had earned a few taels less than usual. Su Fingyin concentrated and took out the spring thunder saber. He imitated the old divine swordsman's posture of holding an umbrella and stabbed the saber into the ground. However, he only stabbed the spring thunder saber into the stone slab. There was no sword intent to speak of. Su Fengnian stabbed it more than 10 times in succession. He could not do anything. He squatted on the ground and did not make a sound. The pattern on the talisman General Xianxia could be copied, but secretly learning the sword intent was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. It was a pity that Jiang Yan'ai, who was full of a sense of justice, did not become a heroine. She angrily said, "So shameless," secretly learning from others. Su Fengnian closed his eyes and slowed down his movements. He was extremely slow. He was so slow that he could feel the qi in his body condensing in his right arm. He could even feel the slight trembling of his muscles. He then merged with the saber and finally concentrated at the tip of the saber. On Mount Wudong, when the ox-riding man taught him the unknown drawing circle fist technique, the first step was to break down the movements as light as the clouds and flowing like water. Su Fengnian practiced the swift saber. Therefore, when he read the Green Water Pavilion sword practice record on the mountain, it was all about swordsmanship. Although practicing the saber required speed, he also knew that slow saber was more difficult. Only in the end could he completely forget about fast and slow. There were no more moves in his heart, only a thought and a thought. Once the thought was moved, no matter if it was a saber or a sword, there would be no more worries. However, these were almost untraceable thoughts of the pavilion in the sky. How many martial artists in the world had practiced hundreds of thousands of sabers and millions of swords in order to reach this realm? When the tip of the saber was only an inch away from the ground, Su Fengnian suddenly exerted force. One saber was still a simple saber. Su Fengnian was somewhat regretful. He murmured, "Too hasty." Standing up and putting away the spring thunder saber, Su Fengnian stretched and said self-deprecatingly, "No hurry, no hurry. I'll listen to old Huang. Rice has to be eaten one bite at a time." Jiang and I, who had thought that something would happen, found that it was all bark and no bite. She curled her lips. Su Fengnian saw her expression and laughed. "Are you laughing at me? You, a heroine who is about to learn swordsmanship from the god of swords and is determined to become the new god of swords. Come and carry my saber. Let's not talk about embroidered winter. Just this 1.5 kilograms of spring thunder. If you can hold it horizontally for an incense stick's time, I'll take it that you've read 10,000 words." Jiang and I raised the sword manual in her hand and said heavily, "Are you listening or not? Even if you don't listen, I'll take it that I've read 3,000 words." Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "I'm not listening today. I still have to draw more while I can remember. Go. I'll give you an extra 3,000 words." Jiang Ni's face was filled with disbelief. She was afraid that it would be another trap. After so many years of being taken advantage of and plotted against, she was already very scared. Ignoring Jiang Ni's thoughts, Su Fengnian walked into the house and continued to scold the Qi practitioners of Dragon Tiger Mountain while painstakingly drawing. This work was like practicing the slow saber. Every stroke required a lot of effort. The old god of swords, Li Chungang, had walked into the courtyard. Jiang and I, who was having a headache about how to deal with the ancient inkstone, stopped and saw the old man walking to the place where Su Fengnian stabbed the saber. She stopped and looked down. The old man, who had nothing to do, was lured in by the last saber strike. Jiang and I looked for a while and left the courtyard when she saw that the old man was just in a daze. Li Chungang bent his back and squinted his eyes as he looked at the strange and thin cracks created by the last saber strike. He clicked his tongue and said, "What saber? Obviously, it's better to learn the sword." The old man tugged at the sheepskin coat. Once he tugged at it, the fur would fall off. He turned around and left. Yu Wei, who was carrying Wu Meinyang, stood further away. The old man glanced at the white cat and the white and plump beauty and mumbled, "There's something wrong with this brat's brain. It's fine if he doesn't eat the cat meat, but he doesn't even touch the little girl." Yu Wei was furious, but she didn't dare to say anything. Old Manly seemed to have lice or something in his crotch. He reached out and scratched it. It felt so comfortable. Fortunately, Yu Wei didn't see this scene. She walked straight into the courtyard and saw Su Fengnian concentrating on drawing something. She hesitated for a moment and prepared to go home quietly. She didn't have anything to do in the first place. It was just that she suddenly changed to a completely unfamiliar place and felt uncomfortable. Moreover, the small courtyard she was in was particularly serene and quiet. There were dozens of green bamboos planted in the courtyard. After reading so many novels and articles about immortals, foxes, and ghosts, she could always imagine that something would float out from the bamboo forest. Compared to the green bamboos, she still preferred the soft and beautiful banana trees. Weren't there many of them here? Before Yu Wei approached, Su Fengnian, who had switched his left hand from holding the brush to his right hand, asked with a smile, "What's the matter?" Yu Wei replied softly, looking at the banana trees. Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment. He joked, "I can't change the courtyard. My things are all here. However, if you like to look at the banana trees, I can get someone to pull out the big bushes in the courtyard and pile them up in your courtyard. How about that?" Yu Wei said shyly and angrily. "Okay." Su Fengnian snapped his fingers. The elusive blue bird stood beside Yu Wei. Su Fengnian said with a smile, "Get someone to move the banana trees." Yu Wei said, "No need." Then she angrily turned around. Even Wu Meinyang lazily stretched out her claws. Looking from the side, the claws slid across the round curve of Yu Wei's chest. Su Fengnian, who happened to catch this charming scene, was a little spellbound. Su Fengnian waved his hand, and Blue Bird retreated. Then he called out to Yu Wei and said with a smile, "Come, let's grind the ink." Yu Wei asked doubtfully, "Huh?" Su Fengnian stretched out his hand and pointed at the famous yellow inkstone on the table, saying, "You grind this." He then pointed at Yu Wei's chest and made a gesture of grinding back and forth. Su Fengnian said with a mischievous smile, "I'll grind this." Yu Wei's face flushed red. She pouted playfully, "Lecture." Looking at Yu Wei, fleeing in panic, Su Fengnian leaned back in his chair. There wasn't a trace of lust in his eyes. He narrowed his beautiful phoenix eyes and turned to look out the window at the moon and sparse stars after the rain. Where is Su Xiao now? Chapter 105. Although Yingliang's county magistrate Jean Lanting was an official born from a local Bailiang family, he was more of a scholar than an official. He did not look forward to climbing up the ranks of the bureaucracy. He only wanted to climb high, write poems, raise geese, pick chrysanthemums, and sing many poems with Yongzhou's famous courtesans. However, when he heard that the king of Bailiang's eldest son, Su Fengnian, was going to stay in Yingliang, and his longtime friend, Uncle Zheng Hanhai, had given him such a big meat pie, Jean Lanting's heart was boiling with excitement. Yingliang was not like the other counties in Yongzhou. After all, it was a bit too close to Bailiang, so it could not be considered to be under the sole pillar of the dynasty. However, in the end, there were many things that required him to look up to Bailiang. To be able to be on good terms with His Royal Highness was a great thing. However, even though it was a good thing, Jean Lanting, who had a lot of mysophobia, still had the beauties in his family leave the residence under the pretext of going for a spring walk. If by any chance His Royal Highness, who had a terrible reputation, took a fancy to them, Jean Lanting was afraid that he would be suffocated to death by a few unexpected green hats. After arranging and cleaning the residence to perfection, Jean Lanting happily went 30 li outside the city to welcome the guests. However, a heavy rain doused Jean Lanting's fiery heart with ice-cold water. The group of people did not even see the shadow of His Royal Highness. When he returned to the city, he was blocked outside the courtyard by a maidservant. He was almost laughed to death by the group of martial artists led by Tang Yinshan. At the time, Yongzhou's secretary Zheng Hanhai, who was still wet from head to toe, could not keep his old face. He waved his sleeves and left on the spot. Jean Lanting also had the spirit of a scholar. Out of sight, out of mind, but this residence was his, so where could he go? Fortunately, the icy cold servant girl behind her took the opportunity to inquire about the old Huangli case, which was one of Jean Lanting's well-known anecdotes in Yongzhou. Immediately, she had a good impression of His Royal Highness, who had a unique insight. The night was long, and Jean Lanting woke up with bloodshot eyes. However, the steward of the residence came early in the morning to complain that the oldest and strongest peach trees in the backyard had been chopped down. His Royal Highness servant girl said that the peach trees were of the best quality and wanted to use them to make a few peach wood swords. Jean Lanting, who was putting on his clothes, gritted his teeth and endured it, telling the steward to not get involved in this matter. However, without waiting for Jean Lanting to swallow his resentment, a small steward who specialized in raising white geese came howling in grief and sobbing. He complained to Jean Lanting about his Royal Highness' evil deeds of killing geese to roast meat. Jean Lanting clutched his chest. This weak scholar, who was quite famous for his poetry in Xianxia, angrily turned around and took down an ancient sword that was hung on the wall as a decoration. His face turned purple, and he was about to fight it out with his Royal Highness. The two stewards saw that their master was about to lose his mind and did not care about offending their superior. They hurriedly blocked the figure of Jean Lanting. One of them grabbed the sword, the other grabbed the waist. Jean Lanting's body was as weak as a woman's. He struggled for a moment, then stomped his foot and threw the ancient sword that he had bought with a lot of money, which he had not unsheathed from its scabbard, to the ground. He sighed and was in a daze. Originally, he thought that his bad luck had come to an end. Who would have thought that a head maidservant would hastily rush into the courtyard and whisper that the two Furins had somehow been invited back to the residence? At this moment, they were roasting a goose together with his Royal Highness. After Jean Lanting heard the grievous news, he immediately fainted. Several servants hurriedly supported the county magistrate into the room in a fluster. That tall and handsome-looking His Royal Highness was truly a devil's fiend that seeing once was better than hearing 100 times. After just one night of peace, the elegant and graceful Ingju Suburo Jean was already lying on a sickbed. The head steward thought for a bit and prepared to go find old Master Jean of the old residence to ask for a countermeasure. His Royal Highness did not seem to want to immediately leave Ingju. He could not possibly let him bring disaster to this residence. With great difficulty, the head steward waited until his master faintly woke up. Then he saw His Royal Highness maidservant standing outside the room and faintly said, "His Royal Highness wants Jean Lanting to first take a few knives and familiarize himself with them. He wants to teach the two Furins how to write cooking goose notes." The pitiful Jean Saburo was half dead as he shouted, "Zheng Hanhai harmed me," before fainting again. At the lakeside, His Royal Highness was in the middle of a shady business of burning the zither and cooking the crane. Just now, he had personally chased a flock of Jean Lanting's beloved white geese from the shore to the lake and made a deal with Jiang and I. Her rowing the boat was equivalent to reading a 1,000-word essay. Then, Su Fengyin used the wooden oar to skillfully knock out 2 of the fattest white geese and then carried them back to the shore. A good lake and a flock of geese had been disturbed until only the sound of the geese was left. On the shore, the 2 beautiful Furins who had been invited back to the residence early in the morning were speechless. One of them was slightly older and had the charm of a young married woman. She was a woman from a noble family in Yongzhou. The other had just entered the residence not long ago and was in the prime of her youth. Although she was young, her figure was slender where it should be and straight where it should be. She was a green and lovely person. Her identity and background were difficult to fathom. It was just that she was an unruly and romantic scholar. Within the dynasty, she had always been the talk of the peddlers and soldiers. A talented scholar and a beautiful woman. Even if another 1,000 years passed, it would still be a good thing. Which great literary master did not have a few close female confidants who could warm his bed and raise his face outside? Studying, being able to read 1,000 grains of rice, and being able to read a jade-like beauty in bed was true ability. Unfortunately, these words were made up by His Royal Highness, who was roasting the goose, and could not be taken seriously. Su Fengyin was able to easily roast fish and roast sweet potatoes, let alone roast the goose that the 2 Furins were dumbfounded by. Other than ruining the white geese that this group of refined scholars liked to rear, He had someone lead Grandpa away to the peach orchard early in the morning to find good peach wood. It seemed that he was deliberately trying to make Jean Sanlang's bootlicking go wrong. Bluebird brought over a few pieces of cooked rice paper. Su Fengyan handed the roast goose job to Jiang and I, allowing her to earn a few dozen copper coins. She took out a piece of rice paper and wiped her hands. Seeing this, the two Furins felt a burst of heartache. Jean Sanlang was not stingy with money, but he was infatuated with these elegant things. The person in front of them was too different. Su Fengyan looked at the slightly older foreign, whose breasts and buttocks were naturally slightly larger. He smiled and asked, "What is the background of this shoe, Xian? I have never seen it before, but it is very smooth to use." "Foreign, tell this Xianxia about it." Replying to His Royal Highness, "This rice paper is called Lanting Xian. This humble concubine's husband personally went to Western Shu to pick out some sandalwood paper and gave it to a local household that had been making paper for generations. At first, they followed the ancient method, and the paper was not heavy. My husband continuously improved it and added hemp into the pure bamboo pulp. Only then did this Lanting Xian, printed with the words Lanting produced by Lanting, appear. It is as white as snow and as soft as cotton. Nowadays, the scholars of Yongzhou all love this rice paper. Even the prefecture overseer praises it for being as soft as silk. A young woman was a young woman after all. Her courage was much greater than the young foreign. Although the woman was older and lacked the natural freshness and liveliness, the taste was like old wine. After being trained by a man, it was brewed bit by bit and had a special charm. Su Fengyan narrowed his eyes and said, "Foreign, is it really as white as snow and as soft as cotton? Isn't it? If His Royal Highness doesn't believe me, you'll know after you try it." The young woman appeared to be alarmed. She deliberately turned her head to avoid looking at Su Fengyan. She gently stared at the cooked rice paper. Her charming eyes were like silk. She did not look like a frightened reaction to being teased at all. Su Fengyan laughed in a low voice and said, "I tried the rice paper last night. Foreign's words are not false, but there are some. Why don't you try it tonight?" The corners of the young woman's mouth curled up. She remained silent. Everything was understood without words. As a young lady from a landowning household, her bearing and magnanimity in the ways of the world was naturally not something that the young foreign, who could not even be called a pretty girl from a humble family, could compare to. Moreover, the young foreign was too preoccupied with her fear to notice the vulgar and amorous words that Su Fengyan spoke while looking at Lu Foreign's chest. The young foreign was only afraid that His Royal Highness would abduct her into the courtyard during the day and do those embarrassing things to her. He was Su Rintu's biological son. As a military officer, he was a prince with a different surname. As a civil official, he had the title of Pillar of the Nation. He had the two most glorious identities of the dynasty. If His Royal Highness really broke the law and committed crimes, what would she do? Sanlang must have heard the news long ago, but he had not shown himself. Did that mean he had tacitly agreed? What should she do? The young foreign's heart raced. She stole a glance at the young and handsome His Royal Highness. On his waist hung a pair of beautifully matched blades. His figure was tall and slender. Compared to Sanlang, he was much more confident and at ease. Moreover, his body was much more sturdy. If she was held in His Royal Highness's arms and pressed under his body. Thinking of this, the young foreign, who felt ridiculous and embarrassed, felt her face burn. She lowered her head, not daring to look at the handsome young master who seemed to be able to make her commit a mistake with just a glance. Jiang and I listened to Su Fengyan flirting with the shameless old woman and did not feel anything. This was the style of the great idiot of Bailiang, Su Xiaoyan. If he had always been that Su Fengyan who was obsessed with blades, she would have felt unfamiliar. The old god of swords had arrived at the lakeside at some point. He took a skewer of half-cooked roasted goose and stuffed it into his mouth. After chewing a few mouthfuls, he was somewhat surprised at Su Fengyan's experience. He gave a rare compliment. "Kid, don't use your blade to scare Jiang and I. Change your profession and open a roasted meat shop. I guarantee that business will be prosperous." Su Fengyan dismissed it with a laugh. He was used to this old man's dog mouth. Nothing good came out of it. Chapter 106. Zhao Ningyun, one of the top disciples of Mount Longhu's Ning generation, said darkly, "Little bald donkey, how dare you pretend to be a monk of the two Zen temples? You're asking for a beating." After Zhao Ningyun finished speaking, he brazenly attacked the north and south little monk. Moreover, his words were quite mysterious. He first threw down a big hat and attacked without giving you a chance to explain. He did not seriously injure or cripple you, but only taught you a lesson and vented the anger in his heart. In the future, if this little monk was really a monk of the two Zen temple, it would just be a misunderstanding. Zhao Ningyun was very clever, but he did not expect the little monk and the little girl to reach the gate of the Taoist master's residence without any obstruction. The little monk stood in front of his beloved little girl and did not intend to fight back. He was here to talk to the Taoist master on the mountain, not to fight. Besides, fighting had never been his strong point. The little monk's skills were only trivial things like washing clothes, cooking, covering for his master, and picking rouge for his master's wife. A breeze brushed past Zhao Ningyun's palm attack. Miss Li Zi saw a young Taoist holding a horsetail whisk walk out of the grand gate of the Taoist master's residence. He used a boxwood hairpin to tie his hair into a bun. His Taoist robe was not the yellow-purple of the Taoist master's residence. It was no different from the ordinary Taoist temple at the foot of the mountain. He wore a pair of white and shabby hemp shoes. If he did not walk out of the Taoist master's residence in the celestial capital, with his old-fashioned face and shabby attire, even pilgrims would not approach him. The Taoist priest, who was no more than 30 years old, lightly waved his white tail whisk. It was the inconspicuous aureole seizing the tail of the 16 styles of Mount Longhu's horsetail whisk. He easily wiped out Zhao Ningyun's attack. On the battlefield, it was best to avoid those brave men with halberds. When it came to Jianghu, if you met a monk or a Taoist who used a horsetail whisk, you should be careful regardless of your age. The horsetail whisk in your hand was extraordinary. This was a warning passed down from generation to generation by the older generation of Jianghu people. The Wudong sect leader Wang Zhonglo broke a river with a finger. Then there was the legend of Mount Longhu, where Taoist Master Zhao once broke 160 imperial guards with a horsetail whisk. When Zhao Ningyun met the solemn Taoist priest who was a generation older than him, he immediately put on a cheeky smile and lowered his eyelids. "Uncle, I'm just joking with the little monk." The Taoist priest ignored his nephew, Zhao Ningyun. He bowed slightly to the little monk in a light red cassock and said stiffly, "Please follow me." The little monk turned his head to look at the east and west. After getting permission, he took the lead and walked into the Taoist master's residence. After entering the main door, he found that there was another door behind the first one. On the white jade floor, there was a huge 8 trigrams Tai Chi diagram. It was full of the mysteries of heaven, which made people feel reverence. The 2 doors were as imposing as the main door. The dragon and tiger bow their heads to the Taoist master, and the ghost and God admire their virtue. Unfortunately, Su Xiao said that he would press down the dragon and tiger's head at the foot of the mountain. In the eyes of some people, this couplet was suspected of slapping the face of the Taoist master's residence. Inside the second door, there was a bell tower with a hanging bell of 9,999 pounds. After the bell tower, there was a magnificent double-eave jade emperor hall. It was the tallest and largest among all the Taoist temples and palaces in Longhu Mountain. There was a statue of the Jade Emperor and 12 heavenly monarchs on both sides of the hall. The 8 golden dragons, which were only one less than the 9 dragons of the Son of Heaven, were coiled in the middle of the hall. They were so lifelike that it seemed that they could fly away with a light touch. The little girl looked up and was very nervous. She followed the little Taoist master and the stupid Nan Nan through the corridor of ancient tablets. Finally, they came to the third door. If they took another step, they would enter the private inner door of the Taoist master's residence. Only emperors, generals, and ministers of the secular world could have such treatment. However, the Taoist horsetail whisk, who was called Uncle by Zhao Ningyun, did not stop. He led the little girl and the little monk in. There were 10 vermilion words on the wall of the courtyard, unparalleled land of the south, the first house on the left of the river. The little girl saw the horizontal words, Immortal Capital of the Xiang country, above her head and secretly stuck out her tongue. She did not feel that it was very impressive when she looked outside, but after entering the Taoist master's residence, even she had to admit that it was indeed much more magnificent than her own home. Even if she did not have the happy scene of rowing boats and watching the red carp jump in the Bailiang Palace, alas, those abbot at home who only knew how to eat and drink did not know how to repair the temple. After all, her home was the first holy land of Buddhism. The third door was divided into 3 halls. At the back of the front hall, there was a round green jade stone that could not be held round by 2 hands. It was called the Welcoming and Sending Stone. The Taoist master would stop here to welcome the distinguished guests of the residence. The Taoist master led the 2 to the hall in one breath and let the 2 rare guests sit down. 2 delicate and pretty Taoist children served tea. In the hall, there were portraits of the first 3 generations of Dragon Tiger Mountain. In the middle of the hall was the first generation of the Taoist master's residence, Zhao Lingzuan. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking like a celestial being. There was a couplet hanging on the wall. What is there to be like? Discipline the demons and evils to retreat. To the left and right were the 2nd and 3rd generation of the Taoist master, Zhao Qiyu and Zhao Jiqing. One was sitting with a sword, and the other was standing with a horsetail whisk. The Taoist master with the horsetail whisk, who looked very similar to the 3rd generation of the Taoist master, waited for the 2 to sit down and said calmly, I'll go and ask the Taoist master to come out of seclusion. Come out of seclusion? That meant the Taoist master Pai Gu was in seclusion. No matter how ignorant the young lady was, she was not stupid enough to trouble the Taoist master of the Zhao family to come out of seclusion to welcome guests. She hurriedly waved her hand and blushed slightly. She smiled awkwardly and said, Taoist master, there's no need to trouble the Taoist master. Let's just drink some tea and then go down the mountain. The Taoist master was probably a stubborn person. He said calmly, It's fine. Chapter 107. The little monk was the exact opposite of the little girl. He was always muddle-headed when it came to small matters. Every day, he would be scolded as an idiot by the little girl's family of 3. After being a monk for a few years, he had worked like an ox or a horse for a few years. But for some reason, he was magnanimous when it came to important matters. He clasped his hands and said, This little monk will talk about Zen with you. The Taoist priest smiled for the first time and slowly said, You know how to talk about Zen, but I don't know how to preach. If you don't mind, I can call Mr. White Lotus out and talk to the master. The little monk respectfully said, Okay. The little girl's face was taut, and she didn't dare to say or laugh. In fact, she was already happy in her heart. Look, although stupid North and South was stupid, he could still hold up his face in some situations. She knew the name of Mr. White Lotus. He was Bai Yu, who was bestowed with a purple robe by the emperor. Years ago, it was this Taoist priest who won the argument on the top of the lotus. When he returned to the temple, he was so angry that he didn't even smile when he saw her. It was a pity that her father only cared about drinking and was punished by her mother to not leave the mountain for a whole year. Otherwise, it was hard to say who would win and who would lose. Stupid North and South couldn't even win an argument. Naturally, he couldn't win an argument with this Mr. White Lotus. But it didn't matter. If he lost, he could find an opportunity to bring Su Fengnian here. Su Fengnian always quarreled with the shrewish village girl. This unknown Taoist priest was much more polite than Zhao Ningyun. He really went to the back hall to call for Mr. White Lotus, who was said to be more arrogant than Mount Longhu. The little girl had just finished a cup of tea when the Taoist priest brought a man in white. Probably because his eyes were damaged from reading too many books, he walked very carefully and habitually narrowed his eyes. His eyes weren't big to begin with, so when he narrowed them, they became a slit. However, he had a very nice and warm smile on his face, which was quite similar to Su Fengnian. The little girl felt comfortable looking at him, and immediately felt that this Mr. White Lotus was a good person. Father said that there would always be good people who were better than her and bad people who were worse than her at the foot of the mountain. If she met a good person, she should be polite, but if she met a bad person, she should run away. If that was the case, then the person called Zhao Ningyun outside the Celestial Master's residence was definitely a bad person, and this white Taoist and the one with the horsetail whisk could be considered good people. Therefore, the little girl stood up and respectfully greeted him, calling him Mr. White Lotus. Mr. White Lotus, who was not wearing a Taoist robe, first bowed to the little monk from afar. When he walked a few steps closer, he saw the little girl's face clearly. He smiled and said, "Miss, you look like a blessing to your husband. Whoever becomes your husband in the future will have a great fortune." Ah, the little girl's face instantly turned red. What should he do? As the saying goes, one does not hit a smiling person. This Mr. White Lotus is really too straightforward. He is even more open than she is. The Taoist priest with a horsetail whisk smiled and said helplessly, "Mr. White Lotus, don't scare the little girl." Mr. White Lotus, who wore the carefree bandana on his head, reached out to touch his bandana and felt a little ashamed. He slowly sat down on a purple bamboo chair and turned his head to look at the little monk who was coming to the Taoist master mansion to talk about his Zen. The young monk did not seem to have any intention of debating. All he did was ask curiously, "This place is called Fox Immortal Hall. Is there really a fox immortal?" Mr. White Lotus shook his head and said no. The little monk said, "Are there any immortals in Mount Longhu?" Mr. White Lotus laughed and said, "I don't think so." The little monk nodded and said, "Then I have no questions." Mr. White Lotus was not disappointed or angry. He was really good-tempered. The little girl felt that the people at the foot of the mountain were not completely right. Mr. White Lotus was not arrogant at all. He was a very amiable uncle. The little Taoist master of Mount Longhu, who was regarded as an amiable uncle by the little girl, smiled and said, "Drink tea, drink tea." The little girl said softly, "After drinking tea, we will go down the mountain." It was hard to imagine that Mr. White Lotus, who once talked to the emperor in the palace, nodded and said, "I have no sense of direction and my eyes are not good. I won't be seeing you off. When the time comes, I will have to trouble this bad-tempered junior brother Chi to help me bring you back." The little girl finished her tea and left the hall with the little monk. She walked out the door in one breath. At the bottom of the stairs, she let out a long breath and patted her chest. The little monk touched his bald head. It was all sweaty. The little girl said jokingly, "Stupid Nambe, are you afraid too?" The little monk blushed and said, "I'm not afraid of quarreling. I'm just afraid of being beaten after the door is closed." In the hall, junior brother Chi asked, "Did you guys talk about Zen?" Bayu lowered his head and drank his tea. He said, "Probably not." The old-fashioned Taoist priest said, "Oh." Bayu joked, "What's the point of quarreling? Look, I'm in a good mood to drink tea. Isn't that better than anything else? An unintelligent little girl and a smart little monk. Isn't that great Zen?" The little Taoist priest frowned and said, "You know I don't understand this." Bayu smiled and said, "Being in a daze is the way of heaven. Being ignorant is Zen. If you don't understand, you understand. If you understand, you don't understand. Do you understand? I think you don't." The Taoist priest with the surname Chi was still expressionless. He asked, "Grandpa Shituan said that the money needed to repair Xiaoyao Temple should be paid by the Taoist priest's residence. In the future, if anyone from Bailiang comes up the mountain, the Taoist priest's residence will be the one to receive them. However, the sect master is in seclusion. The one in the capital also said to ignore this matter. What do you think?" Mr. White Lotus smiled and said, "Let it be. If it's too much, we'll just have another farce of a horse trampling on dragons and tigers. I like excitement. Anyway, you'll be at the front of the fighting. In a few years, you'll be one floor higher than our sect master. By then, who will you be weaker than?" The Taoist priest was silent. Mr. White Lotus squinted his eyes and looked at the portraits of the three ancestral Taoist priests. He sighed and said, "Let's talk about it. If I jinx it, it won't be easy to deal with it. The Su family has a phoenix, and the horse tramples on dragons and tigers. This is a prophecy in the heavenly book." Chapter 108. Su Fengyin did not give Madame Su the opportunity to write cooking goose notes at night because Ningame, the great halberd, led 100 light cavalry from the Phoenix Battalion to Yingyu County at dusk. In the middle of the journey, he seemed to have a conflict with Tang Yinshan, the deputy commandant of the Eastern Jin, and the reason was that the light cavalry had arrived at the city. Tang Yinshan ordered the gate guards to close the city gates in advance. It was rumored that Ningame did not make a sound, but only took out a dozen short halberd from the sack on his back and stabbed them into the city gates one by one. Before Ningame finished shooting the last short halberd, the deputy commandant of the Eastern Jin finally showed weakness and opened the city gates. 100 light cavalry entered on horseback. Ningame only needed one halberd strike to knock Tang Yinshan, who thought his martial prowess was not weak, off his horse. The great halberd pressed against the deputy commandant of the Eastern Jin's chest, making him unable to move. It was extremely humiliating. After meeting up with His Royal Highness, they left Yingyu County together. The head of the civil officials in the city, Zheng Hanhai, was sick and did not come out. Tang Yinshan and Gu Jintang's old subordinates were as silent as cicadas in winter, not daring to show their faces. Only San Lang Jin Lanting, whose residence had been turned into a mess, sent them to the city gates with a bitter face. Looking at His Royal Highness' handsome figure riding on a white horse with 2 sabers, he inadvertently caught a glimpse of the madam who insisted on sending them off. Seeing her absent-minded eyes, it seemed that she was reluctant to part. The henpecked Third Lang Jin felt a tightness in his chest, and he wanted to slap her. Unfortunately, this madam was the legitimate daughter of the Su family, second to none in Yongzhou. He did not dare to hit her, and he did not even dare to speak harshly to her. She was unable to bring an heir to the Jin family, so Jin Lanting had to pinch his nose and endure it. Even the matters between the bed and the red curtains were similarly unspeakable suffering. Until now, he had not even enjoyed being pushed by the old man once. Every time he had to do it with the most strenuous old tree roots. Poor Third Lang Jin Lanting's body was weak and powerless. A good pleasure in the boudoir had become a chore. He really wanted to die. Who could he talk to with this kind of grief and indignation? On the other side of the Jin family's old residence, the wind and rain were not far off. The old master was sitting with Yongzhou's boat Caozi, who was supposed to be recuperating on his sickbed. Zheng Hanhai was sitting in a quiet little pavilion with several beautiful young maids massaging his shoulders and legs. The 2 elders were speechless. The 2 families were the closest friends of the Yingyu family. If not for this, Zheng Hanhai would not have spent so much effort to welcome His Royal Highness into San Lang's private residence. Unfortunately, now it seemed that he did not even get any incense from Bailiang Palace. Instead, he had provoked San Lang into fainting twice. The peach trees were chopped down, the white geese were cooked, and even a few Lanting Rishuan were taken away. There is also the hidden story of the 2 madams being taken advantage of. Zheng Hanhai was very reasonable and did not blame his nephew San Lang for having a grudge against him. Zheng Hanhai smiled bitterly and said, "I originally thought that a person as intelligent as the Pillar Gua, His Royal Highness, would at least be a young man who understood some human feelings. Alas, this time I painted a snake with feet and added to it." This time, the old master of the Jin family, who had given Zheng Hanhai several hundred gold taels to bribe the Yongzhou officialdom, pushed away a maid's delicate hand. Rubbing his temples, he sighed and said, "If it was just spending a bit of money, it would be a small matter. However, we made a big show of getting close to His Royal Highness and provoked the displeasure of those martial artists in the Yingyu family. This is also a small matter. However, those provincial overseers and governors who do not get along with the pillar will all looked at us with cold eyes and laughed at us. This time, in the end, it was this half-dead, dizzy old man who stubbornly insisted on doing things his own way and wanted to make a gamble. However, I implicated you, Hanhai. Originally, your position as Boat Caozi's manager was 50-50. Zheng Hanhai had been an official for several decades. The Jin family had never been lenient when it came to providing money and effort. However, he had failed several times. He had long been forced to accept the position of manager. If he succeeded, it was his fortune. Zheng Hanhai had already taken a wrong step with the old master, but he could not take another wrong step. Even in his old age, he still had to separate himself from the wealthy and overbearing Jin family. As a result, he hurriedly shook his head and said with a smile, "Old Master Jin, these words are too serious. Hanhai can guarantee that before I retire, I will ensure that nephew Sam Lang will have a bright future." The second son of Jiuquan County's Governor Fan Ping has long had his eyes on my small position as Bo Caozi's manager. I will give it to him. Fan Ping is the teacher of our Heian County's new governor. Jun Sam Lang does not lack talent. As long as there is someone who appreciates him, he will definitely have a meteoric rise. The old Master Jin was gratified. Han Hai is considerate. Zheng Han Hai, who had left the city for 30 li and was drenched in rain yesterday, tapped his fingers on the table. He gave the maids at his side a look. The old master understood tacitly. He had these young and tender maids, who were only old enough to be his great-granddaughters, withdraw from the secluded and elegant small pavilion. Only then did Zheng Han Hai say in a low voice, "Old Master Jin, these past few years, Great General Gu has placed his old subordinates in Yong and Quan provinces one after another, faintly forming an encirclement. We have all seen this, just that we haven't said anything. In addition, Grand Secretary Zhang has bad relations with that person from Bailiang. Now that that person has entered the capital at this time, do you think there is some secret behind it?" Old Master Jin's insight is unique, never misjudging people. "Naturally, you can see further than me. Can you give me some pointers?" The old master said in a low voice, "This matter cannot be said. Truthfully speaking, I can't see through it either. This person from Bailiang's conduct and conduct himself is truly... Forget it. This large tree isn't something we can climb up just because we want to." Zheng Han Hai also became silent. The old master suddenly laughed and said, "In my opinion, regardless of how the general situation looks, if it doesn't favor Bailiang, we still shouldn't look down on them. That Tang Yinshan can also be considered a fierce general under Great General Gu's banner. Even if he faces one of Bailiang's four fangs, Ningame, so what? It's just a single strike." When Zheng Han Hai thought of this, his mood improved considerably. Whether Bailiang's military was good or bad, it didn't have much to do with them. It was instead these Tang Yinshan who was the pillar of the state, and Marshal Yang Great General Gu Jintang's Tang Yinshan who was too arrogant and domineering in Yong province, not showing the slightest bit of respect for the local landowning households. It truly was annoying. The next day, Jin family's old master was currently in the study copying the green goat tablet of Wu Taiji's left immortal duke that had only spread through the scholarly clear stream at the beginning of the year. Zheng Hanhai couldn't care less about his bearing, frantically rushing in, shouting in pleasant surprise, "Old Master Jin, great news, great news." It was rare for old Master Jin to see Zheng Hanhai lose his composure like this, and his interest was piqued. He put down his brush and asked, "What's the news?" Zheng Hanhai wiped away his sweat, keeping him in suspense, and said excitedly, "Old Master Jin, do you know that Chu Lushan, who was nicknamed Lu Qiu by His Royal Highness?" Old Master Jin's heart tightened. Who didn't know Chu Lushan in the 10 counties of Liang, Yong, and Quan? Speaking of evil, this Lu Qiu, who was as fat as a pig, was only slightly inferior to the butcher Su Dejugua. He liked to drink fresh milk from women, and he frequently skinned and killed people in the army. During the Spring and Autumn War, although this fat pig wasn't the most murderous deity of Bailiang, Su Xiao was willing to hand over almost all of Bailiang's most secretive and immoral deeds to this adopted son of his. When Eastern Yu and Western Shu were destroyed, the number of imperial concubines killed by this Lu Qiu was more than 10. It was said that 6 princesses of Western Shu were tortured to death by him in one night. Old Master Jin, who was accustomed to ups and downs, was already sweating. No wonder he couldn't keep his cool. As long as it was related to Lu Qiu, how could it be a joyous matter? Had Zheng Hanhai lost his mind? Seeing old Master Jin's strange expression, Zheng Hanhai suddenly woke up and didn't dare to beat around the bush. He laughed and said, "Old Jin, this is really a joyous matter. Lu Qiu brought the new governor, Zhu Jun, to San Lang's residence. Did you know? San Lang has been promoted twice and is going to the capital to be the assistant minister of the Yellow Door. Old Master Jean was stunned. San Lang's greatest wish in this life was to go to the capital to be an official. To be able to be in the big Yellow Door, which was above the small Yellow Door, was a great honor for a scholar. The big and small Yellow Doors were a stepping stone that one had to go through to become a grand scholar in the future. The current Grand Secretary Zhang Jiulu boasted that he was the old Grand Tutor's lackey. Didn't he lie dormant in this noble position of the big Yellow Door for 16 years? When scholars of the Xianxia Academy enter the capital, their first choice had always been the big and small Yellow Doors. How lucky was San Lang to suddenly jump into the blessed land known as the Little Dragon Pavilion? Old Master Jean asked in shock, "Really? Is this true?" Zheng Hanhai exhaled and smiled slowly. Although the appointment hasn't been announced yet, Wuxia said that the Great Pillar State has already written a recommendation. It was written by the Great Pillar State himself. Old Master Jean slapped his thigh. "This matter is settled. The big Yellow Door is already my San Lang's. Who in the world dared to go against the Great Pillar State who rarely recommended officials? His Majesty the Emperor?" Old Master Jean didn't want to and didn't dare to think too deeply about it. Beside the lake in Jean Lanting's residence, San Lang Jean Lanting crawled on the ground, sobbing silently. In front of this Yongzhou scholar who regarded himself as a talented and unrecognized official, stood two important figures whose physiques were as different as heaven and earth. Chu Lushan with squinted eyes and a smile, as well as the nervous Heian governor Zhu Jun Luqiu, who slowly walked out of the residence and boarded the carriage with difficulty. She made a sound of surprise and turned her head to Governor Zhu, who was standing respectfully to the side, and said with a smile, "I heard that a beautiful concubine in the manor just gave birth to a Qilin child for Sir Zhu. I think there's plenty of milk." The dignified Governor Zhu Jun's face was ashen. His Adam's apple moved as he lowered his head and gritted his teeth. "General Zhu, please come back with me to the manor." Unexpectedly, Luqiu laughed and climbed directly onto the carriage, saying, "Forget it. This trip is for His Royal Highness. I don't have time for such delicious food." Zhu Jun looked at the dust rising from the carriage and the Baoyang cavalry charging out of the city. His body trembled. Chapter 109. Yu Yue did not see eye to eye with the old god of swords, whose words and actions were absurd. She was more than happy to ride a horse and ride a cat, enjoying the scenery along the way in Heian County. She glanced at Su Fengyan, who had been whispering to old Taoist priest Judami, and couldn't help but move a little closer. She asked, "Is His Royal Highness very regretful that he wasn't able to teach Lady Su, who has a romantic figure, how to write the cooking goose note?" Su Fengyan was in the middle of asking Grandfather Wei about the mysteries of the final prison gate and several other gates. He hoped that he could learn from the other mountains and turn the invisible and intangible Great Yellow Court into his own. Hearing Yu Yue's sarcasm, he said disapprovingly, "Do you believe that if I go back to Ingliang County, Jean San Lang would be willing to offer Lady Su to this heir to add fragrance and warmth to his bed?" He even knew that Lady Su and I were having an intimate night together, yet he was still able to sleep with a smile on his face. Yu Yue ignored the vulgar words about adding fragrance and warmth to his bed. With a face full of disbelief, she asked, "Is he crazy?" Su Fengyan smiled and pretended to be profound. He said, "He's not crazy. Jean San Lang can't pick up a sword, but he's good at reading the books of the saints. He didn't become a saint, but he learned how to conduct himself. Therefore, he's a smart person." Yu Yue only felt scared. She was once the daughter of a West Chu official. She was no stranger to gifting maidservants to make connections. However, gifting Lady Su to an outsider was still too shocking for her. The most surprising thing was that Su Fengyan only did evil in Ingliang Mansion. She heard that Jean Lanting had fainted several times due to anger. Could it be that he had really gone crazy? Yu Yue rubbed Wu Meinyang's soft and round body without saying anything. 3 years of traveling, 1 year of practicing the knife, and more than a year of interaction with Su Fengnian before his travels. Thinking about it carefully, they had known each other for 5 years. However, Yu Wei found that she increasingly couldn't understand His Royal Highness. His absurdity was still the same as before, but the shady business of buying poems to pretend to be refined, bringing evil slaves to steal young ladies, and giving generous gifts to wanderers was just absurd. Now, there seemed to be something hidden behind his absurdity. Yu Wei to him. Su Fengnian didn't point out the mystery behind it. After encountering the little Taoist general in red armor and waiting for the old man Li Chungang to retreat with 2 swords, he used a snow-white spear falcon to send a secret letter to Wuxia, who was hiding behind the enemy. Then he went to Yingliang Jin Mansion to torment Jin Sanlang until he wanted to die, and sent another letter. The promotion of Jin Lanting's official title was his own idea. There was no such thing as the Great Pillar State's personal recommendation. In the Liang dynasty, Su Xiao, who was nominally the leader of the civil and military officials, had a much better say than Su Fengnian. However, in the Su family, Su Fengnian's words were 100 times more effective than Su Xiao's. When Su Fengnian said that he wanted Jin Lanting to be the assistant minister of the Yellow Door, how could Su Xiao not agree? Lu Qiu'er, who knew that everything in the Su family had its vanquisher, was just going with the flow. On the other hand, the halberd Ningame met Lu Qiu'er on his way back from Bailiang, and was immediately supplemented with more than 40 light cavalry. This was beyond Su Fengnian's expectation. Inside the carriage, Jiang and I received an extra 100 copper coins and was in charge of taking care of the calligraphy that Su Fengnian had collected. The rice paper that was made from the Sanskrit characters of the red armor talisman was also organized and stored in a book chest by her. At this moment, she was holding a piece of paper that was indecipherable from the heavenly book and was fiercely studying it, but she couldn't see the knack of it. Old Li, who was wearing a sheepskin fur coat, was scratching his feet while looking at Jiang and I, who was frowning. He really couldn't bear to see such an exquisite seedling being ruined by that Su brat, so he kindly advised her, "Jiang and I, don't look at it anymore. That brat is deliberately mystifying things. He doesn't have any good intentions in letting you take care of it. In this old man's opinion, you don't even need to read books. He's not afraid that you'll memorize all these secret manuals in your head. Even if you memorize them all, so what? You reading books is beneficial to him because he has already reached a higher level in martial arts. The more books he listens to, the deeper his feelings will be. On the other hand, the more you read, the more complicated your thoughts will be, and the more you won't know where to start." This old man's words are still the same. As long as you're willing to wholeheartedly practice the sword, not to mention Su Brat, who practices the saber, even Dong Tai won't dare to look down on you. Jiang and I didn't even raise her head and said, "Don't bother me. If I don't read books, you'll give me money?" The old god of swords said dejectedly, "What that brat said is true. Little girl, you really only care about money." Jiang and I, who was looking at the painting on the Xian paper, raised her head and glared at him. "Why do you care?" The eccentric Li Chungang liked this little girl's angry appearance the most. He pointed at the top of his head and said with a smile, "Be careful that this old man doesn't return this divine talisman to you." Jiang and I put away the Xian paper and picked up the Thousand Swords Grass Compendium that the old man said wasn't up to standard. She read it carefully. Her memory wasn't good. She couldn't even remember it after reading it 3 times, let alone memorizing it like Su Fengnian. As for the principles of the secret manuals, she only understood half of it and was confused about it. It was very troublesome. The carriage suddenly stopped. Jiang Mi's mood became excited. The first time she stopped the carriage, she saw Chen Zhibao in white sending her off. The second time she saw a strange red-armored man blocking the way to assassinate Su Fengnian. This time, Jiang and I lifted the curtain and was a little disappointed. However, His Royal Highness, who loved to drink, saw a wine stall on the side of the road and took the old Taoist priest Wei Shuyang to drink. After Grandpa Wei and Yu Wei sat down, Su Fengnian said, "The apricot wine sold on the roadside in Liangzhou is either heavily diluted or simply fake. Although the shop is small, the wine is authentic." especially since the place where we are sitting is very close to the well beside the red-crowned crane pavilion. The water in the well is excellent, and it is a perfect match for making wine. The wine is very heavy. The method of steaming and then clearing, which has become popular in recent years, was passed down from the nearby villages. The wine is fragrant, and the taste when it enters your mouth, TSK, delicious. Waiter, give me 2 pounds of apricot wine and as much beef as you have. Chapter 110. The waiter of the wine stall had already seen that this handsome young master did not lack money. When he heard him praise the apricot wine, he laughed even more. To wine sellers, this wine was like their children, which parents did not like others praising their children. What's more, everything this young master said was reasonable. The well near the Red Crown Crane Pavilion was a local historical site that had been around for a long time. Scholars from Yong and Quan provinces often came here with beautiful women to recite poems. However, these scholars with noble status looked down on the roadside stalls. Although the wine tasted authentic, it did not match their status. The owner of the wine stall was not vexed. Today, it could be said that his ancestral grave was emitting smoke. Such a knowledgeable young master had come. Judging from his accent, was he from Liangzhou? The wine stall owner carefully looked at the 3 retainers who didn't have a right to sit. The woman was really coquettish. Her perky but was much bigger than his yellow-faced wife's. The burly man with a huge sword was scary. As for the sickly man with a pale face, the wine stall owner ignored him. He only confirmed that he was a human shadow and not a ghost. It was broad daylight, so what was there to be afraid of? After attentively serving wine and meat, the owner glared at the young man who was staring at the beautiful woman holding the white cat in a daze. He was so angry that even he didn't dare to look at the woman. This bastard had eaten a leopard's gall. How was he going to do business? The owner kicked the man's leg, which brought him back to his senses. The owner had heard that the big and small playboys from Bailiang were heroic, but when they crossed the border to cause trouble, which time didn't the young masters from Yong and Quan suffer enough? The local tyrants of Yongzhou were no match for the dragons crossing the river from Bailiang, especially the number 1 playboy in Bailiang, His Royal Highness. This young master's arrogance and domineering was the best in the world. Fortunately, our small family didn't have to meet him in this lifetime. The owner, who had never studied but had heard a lot of apricot poetry, smiled with pride and flattery. This young master looks like an expert. I heard from my grandfather that our apricot flower was written about in the Yongzhou geographical annals. Su Fingyin poured Yue a cup of sparkling apricot wine and said with a smile, "Yes, the new well outside the Red Crown Crane Pavilion. The water is heavy and contains crab roe. They're praising this wine." This time, the boss was truly intimidated. He praised from the bottom of his heart. Young master's knowledge is as vast as the sky. Su Fingyin laughed and said, "Then can you give us a discount?" The boss was immediately stunned and put on a difficult expression. Bootlicking didn't cost a single copper coin. If the price was pushed down, it would be a small business and the hard-earned money would be dug out bit by bit. How much heartache would be? Fortunately, the young master was only joking. He said considerately, "I'm just joking. I'm already very grateful to be able to drink apricot flower wine." In the past 2 days, Xianxia, who had become increasingly curious about His Royal Highness, saw Su Fingyin holding a dirty bowl and drinking inferior wine from a remote and desolate place. She was even more puzzled. Although she came from the wilderness of the southern kingdom, she had been a witch since young and was worshipped as a deity. When it came to basic necessities, she couldn't compare to His Royal Highness. Later, she defected from her sect and wandered the Jianghu alone. There was an endless stream of admirers, so Xianxia had never been shabby. Seeing Su Fingyin so casual about trifles, she was really puzzled. Jiang and I followed the craving old god of swords down the carriage and sat on the bench opposite Su Fingyin's table. Yue took a sip of the warm apricot flower wine. It tasted good and was different from Bailiang's green ant wine. She asked softly, "What's the story about this well?" Su Fingyin was narrowing his eyes and savoring the fragrance of the wine on the tip of his tongue. When he heard the question, he smiled and said, Legend has it that there was an immortal on Mount Wudong who was resting on a crane in a pavilion. Seeing the simple customs of the people, he couldn't bear the hunger and thirst of the people, so he spat mouthfuls of saliva into the well. From then on, the well water was sweeter than the famous springs in the forest. Yu You's expression was unnatural. Saliva? Su Fengyan laughed and said, "Perhaps some people's saliva is sweet. I want to taste it, but unfortunately, I can't be sure." Yu You's cheeks flushed. She didn't know if it was because of the cup of apricot flour in her hand or because of someone's drunken words. Old Manly rolled his eyes and muttered, "Little Jiang, let's give up the carriage later. This old man is sick of seeing the two of them flirting all day and not doing anything serious." Jiang and I, who didn't drink, said angrily, "Pay up. No, 10 times. Su Fengyan was just about to attack the little mud man who demanded too much when he caught a glimpse of Ningame riding alone. This Bailiang brave general was meticulous and didn't use his halberd. He dismounted and was about to call out, "Your Highness," when Su Fengyan waved his hand and said, "Come, let's drink. Waiter, bring 2 caddies of wine." Ningame didn't stand on ceremony. He stood and drank 3 big bowls. His expression was the same as usual. Most likely, he could drink 1,000 cups without getting drunk. This wasn't strange. The Bailiang cavalry was strict, but every time they destroyed an enemy or massacred a city, they could drink to their heart's content. Among the generals and soldiers from Bailiang, there were very few cowards with poor alcohol tolerance. Ningame omitted the frightening title His Royal Highness. Ever since that day when Chen Jibao personally led 300 cavalrymen to send him off, he was forced to stand on the same line as Bailiang's Double Fang's heroic beast Wei Fuqing. His Royal Highness didn't have a good expression, so he didn't have a chance to speak after meeting His Royal Highness again. Ningame's official rank wasn't high, so he didn't care if he could use this opportunity to be on good terms with His Royal Highness. It was just that he had humiliated those former subordinates of the Pillar of the State and Great General of Wuyang Gu Jiantang at the gate of Yingyu City. It was hard to guarantee that the deputy commandant of the Dongjin Imperial Guard wouldn't jointly report him for indiscriminately starting a war. As a general of Bailiang, Ningame didn't need to care about this kind of trivial matter. However, if he made His Royal Highness feel that he was being reckless, then he really couldn't face the 40 or so comrades who had been killed or injured. Therefore, when he heard that the cavalry ahead had stopped, he rode alone and wanted to say a few words of conscience that wouldn't make his face red. He only hoped that His Royal Highness wouldn't take his anger out on the Phoenix Battalion, which was worthy of being called Bailiang's army's men. The owner of the liquor store and the waiter all sensibly stood far away. This man was born with a strong back and a strong waist. He was wearing heavy armor and had an overbearing aura. He did not look like an ordinary soldier. Could he be one of the generals in Heong County? Ningame lowered his voice and said, "At the Yingzhou city gate, Ningame taught a lesson to those fellows who closed the city gate." Su Fengyan interrupted Ningame's words and laughed softly. "General Ning, do you think you vented your anger by knocking down the Eastern Forbidden City's deputy commandant with your halberd? If I was there, wouldn't I let you strip him of his armor and hang him on the city gate? If you think you've gone too far and are afraid of causing trouble for me, fine, I'll regret treating you to those 3 bowls of wine. But if you still think it's not enough, I'll treat you to 3 more bowls of wine. How about it?" Ningame suddenly showed a heroic spirit. He was in high spirits, which made this Bailiang's second Fong look extraordinarily majestic. Then Ningame must drink 3 more bowls of wine. Chapter 111. Regardless of how LV Qiantang and Yang Qingfeng used to conduct themselves, whether they were open-minded or insidious, they had been forced to develop a cautious temperament in the Prince of Northern Liang's mansion, which had a strict hierarchy like that of an emperor's family. The conversation between His Highness Heir Apparent and the great halberd Ningame went in one ear and out the other, so they did not dare to think about it. Only Xu Xiao, who was a girl among the 3, was willing to carefully observe the situation. She was not familiar with the inner workings of the Bailiang army, but she could see that His Royal Highness' casual words had vaguely won the general's sincere affection. Drinking big bowls of wine, 6 bowls of wine down his stomach. The man's heroism was endless. If she were His Royal Highness, she would definitely strike while the iron was hot. For example, she would invite General Ning to sit down and drink. At the very least, she would comfort him with a few words about the tragedy of the Phoenix Battalion's casualties. However, after His Royal Highness invited him to drink, he turned around to tease the white cat. He insisted that his pet, whose nickname was Wu Mainyang, also drink. He said that if a drunk rat dared to slash a cat with a saber, then the drunk cat dared to kill a tiger with a sword, causing the beautiful courtesan to hug the cat and hide. Sure enough, it was just as the old man, who was at the level of a land sword immortal, had said. His Royal Highness really liked some small and charming affairs. He had no choice but to be patient and not eat meat. This made Xianxia, who was proficient in the 18 types of martial arts and 36 positions in bed, unable to display her skills. How could His Royal Highness be so unromantic? After drinking wine and eating meat, Su Fengyan's body was full and warm. Just as he was worrying about not having any entertainment, he saw 2 young swordsmen appear on the wide official road. They held their swords and stood across the road. Their elegance and bearing were rarely seen in the common people of the marketplace. What was even rarer was that the 2 young swordsmen seemed to have made an appointment. One was wearing a fluttering white robe, the other was wrapped in a glaring black robe. One in black and one in white stood on the side of the road. In addition to Su Fengyan's table of extravagant spenders, there were 4 or 5 tables of drinkers who had stopped to rest. These people did not have much money in their pockets, but their interest in watching the spectacle was no less than His Royal Highness's in the past. Each and every one of them widened their eyes, wanted to see these 2 wanderers display some beautiful moves so that they could show off to their friends and family. Yongzhou was not like Beiyang, where the folk customs were valiant and wanderers everywhere. Both the old and new provincial governors had vigorously banned martial arts within their borders. The current Yongzhou provincial governor, Tianzong, was Great General Gu's favorite disciple in the past. In the southern Han country, he was the first to obtain the first merit of crossing the river. Tianzong, who was a martial artist, was not the slightest bit lenient towards the younger generation. He had a group of 300 light cavalry specifically to deal with those scoundrels who played with spears and sticks. Once they were caught, they would ruthlessly deal with them. When they were thrown into prison, they would be whipped until their flesh was split open. If they were disciples of Jianghu's sects, they would be investigated and punished. As a result, it was very difficult for Yongzhou to see the flourishing scene of the martial arts world 20 years ago. The 2 swordsmen fought until the sky turned dark and the earth turned dark. They exchanged blows back and forth, and the coordination of their sword moves was so seamless that it made the layman exclaim in admiration. Soon, the bored drinkers, who had their eyes widened, cheered and applauded loudly. Dust immediately flew up on the official road. A few carriages passing by stopped to admire the dazzling sword moves and sword momentum. Su Fengyan turned his head to look at the carefully arranged show. In the past, when he was in Beiyang, he was just a bystander and was happy to tip a lot of silver taels. Now that he had started practicing the saber, he had seen the fierce saber of the white fox face and the white-haired old man, and he had personally blocked countless sword moves of the Wudong sword maniac Wang Xiaoping, not to mention the 2 sword moves of the old god of sword Li Chungang. The 2 swordsmen's spirit was weak, and their crude sword moves were even more difficult to master. After watching for a while, Su Fengyan felt bored and asked with a smile, "Lu Qiantang, how many sword moves of yours can these 2 people block when they work together?" Lu Qiantang, who had been watching the tide and practicing the big sword and wholeheartedly forging the vigorous sword will, answered truthfully, "Not even 1 sword move." Su Fengyan looked at Yu Wei and joked, "These 2 people are waiting here, trying their best to swindle some silver taels from me. Their intentions are commendable. Look at their brand new clothes. They might have saved money from starvation. Moreover, Yongzhou prohibits martial arts very strictly. If they dare to compete on the official road, they must have some courage. Yue, do you think they should be rewarded?" It should be known that Yu Youwei's mother was the head of the sword servants of the late emperor of West Chu. Although she had only learned a little of the splendid sword dance, she had understood most of its spirit. Naturally, she was not interested in these two pretentious embroidered pillows. She shook her head and said, "Their sword skills are mediocre. They shouldn't be rewarded." Su Fengyin did not say anything. He picked up his wine bowl and drank a mouthful of wine. He was in a daze, which was a bit abnormal. On the official road, the two swordsmen saw that there was no movement here for a long time. When they heard that His Royal Highness was traveling in Liangzhou, they began to rehearse for a long time. They were about to use up all the moves they had practiced for a long time. It was inevitable that they were anxious. The white-robed swordsman was unsettled and accidentally forgot to follow the rehearsal sword move, injuring his opponent. As a result, the black-robed swordsman was also injured and began to fight with all his might. This inadvertently attracted the attention of the spectators, who did not know what was going on. They were extremely excited. They only felt that this fierce battle was really exciting. There was even blood. How could such a soul-stirring competition between experts be compared to a common villager carrying a kitchen knife and a hoe? Some of the customers who were short on money and could only carefully count their copper coins to buy wine were willing to each order a few more bowls of apricot wine. Chapter 112. Su Fengyin did not go to watch the clumsy fight between the two poor wanderers. He only remembered a friend he met during his travels years ago. Apart from little Li, who was a generous acquaintance and confidant, only that fellow named Wan Hua was willing to travel with him. That fellow's parents seemed to have passed away early. After spending a few years with his brother and sister-in-law, he could not stand his snobbish sister-in-law's sarcastic remarks. In a fit of anger, he began to wander the Jianghu alone. To say that he was alone was not appropriate, because this pauper was so poor that he could only cut a wooden sword and hang on his waist. How could he afford a horse? Although when Hua was poor, his ambition was boundless. He said that he wanted to find a famous master to practice a famous sword. He wanted to make a name for himself so that he could return home and bring glory to his ancestors. He wanted to obtain an expensive and good sword with sword benefits. Su Fengyin once asked him how he would deal with his sister-in-law when he returned home. This fellow replied that his sister-in-law was his sister-in-law after all. No matter how short-sighted he could not really do anything to her. However, if by any chance he was successful, he could let his brother hold his head high and no longer have to endure his sister-in-law's anger every day. Every time this Wan Hua saw old Huang leading the skinny red horse, it was as if he saw a good sword. However, Su Fengyin was on tenterhooks, afraid that this fellow who had gone crazy from longing for a sword would really steal the horse and sell it for money. However, before they parted, no such mishap had occurred. Just as Wan Hua himself said, a sword would only be his own if he bought it with his own money. However, this fellow also had some unscrupulous thoughts. For example, in the various martial arts competitions to find a spouse, he had overestimated his ability and shamelessly went up on stage. When was he not beaten to the point of vomiting blood? There were a few times when he was beaten down. He walked up the stage and flew down. It was truly a miserable sight. Su Fengyin, who was watching from below the stage, was sweating cold sweat. He could only strenuously carry him away from the stage. Fortunately, every time he was half dead and half alive for a period of time, he could be vigorous and lively again. He would change the venue and continue to go up the stage to compete, humiliating himself and boosting his opponent's confidence. This fellow who was clamoring to treat his good brother to a few caddies of cooked beef, was he well now? Had he earned enough money to buy a sword? Had he met a good girl that he liked? He said that a good girl did not have to be good-looking, but must be a kind girl, a silly girl who was willing to wait for him to practice his sword and have a bright future. Su Fengyin suddenly came back to his senses and said, "Of course." Yu Yue was baffled and did not refute. How could she stop His Highness, who had grown up in a mountain of gold and silver and had never been afraid of spending money on nothing, when he said he wanted to reward her? Besides, why should she stop him? When she was still the #1 courtesan in Liangzhou, she had heard the young courtesans say, that although many dandy young masters spent lavishly in the brothels as if they were from the top aristocratic families, in reality, they were just competing to save face. When they returned home, they would be beaten by their fathers. Moreover, they were often even colder and stingier to the servants by their side. In comparison, Yu Wei preferred this as Royal Highness, who was willing to spend a fortune on anyone. The evil servants of the prince's mansion were willing to fight to the death for his Royal Highness, acting as accomplices to the evildoer. However, Yu Wei had privately heard a secret that when Su Fengnian was in danger and was about to be assassinated, several evil servants did not hesitate to use their bodies to block the sword. They faced death one after another without fear. As for the reason behind this, Yu Wei did not dare to investigate. Su Fengnian picked up the wine bowl and was about to drink. He raised a large white bowl in his hand and asked Jiang and I, "How much do you think I should reward them?" Jiang and I sneered, "It's not my silver. If you want to reward them, go ahead. Even 1,000 gold is fine." Su Fengnian said self-mockingly, "I didn't bring that much, and I can't bear to. It's better to be frugal when going out. All right, round it up and give him 1,000 taels." Su Fengnian snapped his fingers. Blue Bird, who was most in tune with his Royal Highness, turned around and went into the carriage to get the banknotes. If it was 1,000 taels of silver, the two injured swordsmen would be so tired that they would vomit blood just by carrying them. If they went out and exposed themselves, wasn't that just seeking death? Did they really think that the world was peaceful and no one would pick up lost things? Jiang and I, whose face was full of indifference, quietly turned her head. The little girl, who was not good at math, stretched out her fingers to calculate. If one hand wasn't enough, she added another small hand with calluses. After much difficulty, she calculated the result. Her face immediately fell. 1,000 taels, 1 copper coin per word. 1,000 copper coins was 1 tael of silver. Wouldn't she have to read a whole million words of secret manuals and classics? She might not even be able to earn 1,000 taels of silver, even if she finished reading that box of books. Practicing the sword seemed to be quite good. Didn't those two wanderers earn 1,000 taels with just a few bowls of wine? Jiang and I, who was secretly calculating, sighed and muttered, "But practicing the sword is really hard." Raising her head to look at the old god of swords, who was once invincible in the world but only had one arm left, Jiang and I felt that it was better to give up. Studying and earning money was good enough. The two swordsmen didn't hear the rumor that His Royal Highness had said, "It's a skill and should be rewarded." They were very disheartened. Moreover, they didn't even have the energy to drink milk in this competition, so the fighting momentum was inevitably weakened. They were suspected of having a strong start, but weak finish. Those onlookers who didn't need to move their hands and only needed to move their mouths to drink wine couldn't see the knack. But how could they not see the difference in the intensity of the fight? Seeing that the two wanderers were getting more and more sloppy in their fight, they began to jeer and boo. On the official road, the two swordsmen, whose mouths were full of dust, had the urge to rush over and beat these bastards up. However, with the presence of the high and mighty crown prince, they could only suffer in silence. Indeed, as Su Fengnian had predicted, even their new clothes were bought on credit. Their swords, which were worth some money, were already in their possession. Otherwise, they would have lost everything and would not be able to face their confidants, who were eagerly waiting for them to go back and buy rouge and face powder. The heavens had opened their eyes. Blue Bird walked slowly, handing 2 stacks of 500 taels of silver notes to the young swordsman. One of them couldn't help but look at the beauty in front of him when he took the notes. His vision blurred, and he flew backward, landing heavily on the ground. The other wanderer was shocked. He didn't care about exposing himself, and hurriedly ran over to help his companion. He hurriedly took a small path to escape. Seeing this funny scene, Yu Wei couldn't help but smile. Su Fengnian didn't smile at all. He just lowered his head and drank a mouthful of wine. He said to himself, "Wenhua, so what if you can't afford a good sword? I hope you can always carry this broken wooden sword and become famous all over the world. When the time comes, according to our agreement, you will treat me to beef and I will cheer you on." The old god of swords, Li Chuangong's expression changed slightly. Looking at His Royal Highness, who is acting a little strange today, the old man habitually tugged at a sheepskin coat and said softly, "Boy, find a time to fight with that Lu fellow. This old man will watch the show. It's more interesting than watching two idiots who don't even deserve to carry a sword fooling around." Su Fingyan, who was busy thinking about the promise he made years ago, didn't hear the old man's words clearly. He raised his head and asked in surprise, "What?" The old man, who had always been sarcastic to His Highness the Crown Prince, felt as if the sun had risen from the west. He said calmly, "I'll let you fight with the one surnamed Lu." Su Fingyan said in a low voice, "All right." Chapter 113. Of course, Lu Qiantang wasn't deaf. He heard that the old Sword Immortal Senior wanted him to spar with His Royal Highness. Although it was mostly a manual job to slowly feed His Royal Highness, what he practiced was the tide-watching heavy sword. His attacks weren't as delicate and precise as other sword techniques. What if he injured His Royal Highness? Who would he complain to? Looking for the Pillar State, who was known for being protective of his own people, would be courting death. Talking to His Royal Highness about the principle that swords and sabers have no eyes? No matter how he looked at it, this His Royal Highness didn't seem like a master who was easy to talk to. Who knows? He might even be made to suffer along the way. Lu Qiantang lamented in his heart. "Forget it. I'll just deal with whatever comes my way. When the time comes, I'll just have to go all out. At worst, I'll just stand there and let His Royal Highness hack at me a few times." Xu Xiao, who had been told to get lost by Su Fingyan during the battle with the red-armored man, smiled. "How about it? This time, it's your turn to be defeated, Lu Qiantang. You just had to learn swordsmanship. This old lady wants to see how you're going to deal with this." Xu Xiao lightly spat on herself. "What old lady? This little girl is still young. How many girls in the world can still be as beautiful as me when they reach the age of 30? Pinching her face, her skin could even drip water. Xu Xiao, who hadn't been a witch for many years, was admiring herself. Su Fingyan had already stood up. Bluebird paid the bill and gave a few extra taels of silver, making the wine stall overjoyed. Looking at the procession of horses slowly moving, the wine stall owner sat on an empty bench, weighing the taels of silver in his hand. It was rare for him to pour himself a bowl of apricot distiller's grains from the bottom of the wine jar. This thing couldn't be sold for a few copper coins, but it could relieve tiredness. The old doctor even said that it could cure rheumatism and frostbite. Some villagers who were bitten by snakes and bees had a habit of asking for some distiller's grains to cure themselves. The shop owner raised his head and looked at the 3 dusty words on the banner, thinking that he should take it down and clean it properly. Just as he was thinking about this small matter, he felt the ground tremble violently. Turning his head, he saw a general holding an unfamiliar huge weapon, leading over 100 cavalrymen charging past. The innkeeper rubbed his eyes. He was not mistaken. It was the heavily armored general who had been extremely respectful in front of the elegant young master. He had seen the Yongzhou army's appearance from afar a few times, and it was already shocking enough. However, the cavalrymen in front of him were even more majestic and sharp. Other than the burly general at the front, all of them were riding fine horses and wearing light armor. Each of them was equipped with a standard Bailiang saber and carried a crossbow on their backs. The innkeeper could vaguely recognize that saber. During the Spring and Autumn War, the reputation of this killing saber had long spread throughout the world. In the early days of the dynasty, countless people were proud of obtaining a Bailiang war saber. Later on, the imperial court issued a decree forbidding anyone other than Bailiang soldiers from carrying such a saber. Otherwise, they would be punished for violating the law. Only then did this turbulent trend gradually die down. Damn, which one of the children in Yongzhou's mink fur coat could have 100 elite cavalrymen following closely behind them? Was it a descendant of a general from Bailiang who came to Yongzhou to play? However, Yongzhou had clearly been competing with Xuanzhou and Liangzhou for the past few years. This was something that even a commoner like him was well aware of. How could a dandy from Bailiang have the boldness to mobilize an army to gallop within Yongzhou's borders? Wasn't this forcefully slapping our provincial governor Tion's face? The innkeeper carefully put away the silver pieces. With one hand, he protected the half-empty bowl of white wine. He raised his other hand and waved it to disperse the dust. After thinking for a while, he still could not figure out the background of this gentle and elegant young master. In short, he was an important figure that he had never seen before in his life. The innkeeper waited for the dust to dissipate before raising his bowl and drinking a mouthful of distilled grains. He sighed emotionally and said, "This young master's family background is truly impressive. When I get back, I will have a good talk with my wife who has never seen the world. Sigh, it's a pity that he's not from our Yongzhou. Otherwise, I would have some face to talk about him with others." Yuan Ming, who once fought alongside Ningame in the heavy rain against that terrifying red-armored man, was a military officer from a mid-tier noble family in Bailiang. His career as a civil official was not smooth, so he joined the army in Bailiang. Since young, he had learned martial arts from a reclusive martial arts instructor who had retired from the Jianghu. Yuan Ming's spear techniques were imparted to him. Although he could not compare to Xiao Tu, who was taught by the spear immortal Wang Xiu from the northern lands, he could still be considered a valiant general who could take charge of an area on his own. To be honest, it had only been a day since he left Bailiang, but he had already lost dozens of his brothers. This made Yuan Ming, who viewed his soldiers as his own hands and feet, so angry that he wanted to vomit blood. What was even more depressing was that he could not show this grievance on his face. He did not dare to speak irresponsibly to His Royal Highness. The funny thing was that Yuan Ming and Great Halberd Ning Amei's military rank were actually the same, secondary rank 6, a position that was neither high nor low. However, Yuan Ming was sincerely convinced by General Ning. Bailiang's 4 fangs were obviously inferior to the Zhuge's 6 foster sons. However, in the Bailiang army, the 6 leading generals held high positions and power, so it was inevitable that they would not be able to reach them. The 4 fangs tiger generals, on the other hand, were easier to see with their own eyes. On the battlefield at the border, they could be seen during celebrations and drinking. In Yuan Ming's opinion, General Ning was the most trusted of the 4 fangs. Every time he broke through enemy lines, he would lead the troops, just like the Zhuge. When he returned to his tent, he was amiable and approachable. He was much easier to get along with than Dian Xiongzhao, who had a bad temper and was prone to whiplash. Especially in the small Heian County, General Ning used his halberd to knock down the Eastern Forbidden City's deputy commandant who did not have eyes. This was the valiant general of Bailiang. Ningame suddenly raised his halberd and stopped his horse. He turned around and laughed loudly at all the light cavalry. His Royal Highness told me, when we were drinking, that if he was at the Yingliang city gate that day, he would strip that Eastern Forbidden City's deputy commandant naked and hang him on the city gate. Yuan Ming was startled. The 100 personal cavalry of the Phoenix Battalion probably had the same expression as their leader, Yuan Ming. Their hearts were somewhat moved, but they did not take it seriously. Ningame only passed on the message and then continued to urge his horse forward. That giant halberd almost dragged the ground. According to the schedule, they would enter a city to rest at dusk. Su Fengyan did not enter the city. He let Lu Qianeng pick a small path to enter the Qingxing mountain range. This meant that unless they found the temple on the mountain, the group would have to sleep in the wilderness tonight. Qingxing Mountain had 64 peaks, big and small. The peaks encircled the mountain like a city. The ancient trees were green all year round, and the greenery was thick. That was why it was named Qingsheng. Chapter 114. Yongzhou had 3 wonderful sceneries. The easternmost was the West Sword Pavilion, which was said to have been created by a sword immortal with a sword coming from the east. It was the most dangerous place. In the south was the Kuei Gate Pass, which was said to have been passed by a saint riding an ox. The third was the Taoist Holy Land, where the Qingsheng king was born. It was originally a paradise of the 9 Pecks of Rice sect, but the verdant Gazelle Palace Master, who was bestowed to the Qingsheng king by the old emperor, was a Taoist priest from the Dragon and Tiger sect. He had taken over the 9 Pecks of Rice sect and expelled all the 9 Pecks of Rice sect, leaving only the verdant Gazelle Palace. Therefore, the number of incense in the Qingqing mountain decreased sharply every year. It was much more deserted than the other famous mountains, which was really inconsistent with the Qingqing mountain's reputation. Misfortunes never come singly. There were fewer visitors, but there were more bandits occupying the mountain and calling themselves kings. Groups of stragglers and wandering soldiers were untraceable, and they often called themselves kings together with the Qingqiang king. It was very troublesome for the government to exterminate them. Even if there were a lot of old hunters willing to take the risk to lead the way, they often failed. After several twists and turns, the county governor saw that the verdant gazelle palace master did not appreciate the kindness and even turned the tables by saying that the government was stirring up trouble and was noisy on this quiet place. He was even more unwilling to waste money and manpower, unless it was a high-ranking official who had nothing better to do and came to Qingqing Mountain for sightseeing. Unfortunately, they were robbed and forced to send troops into the mountain. The government was waiting for Qingqiang Mountain to become a dead mountain and a dead city. They wanted to see how the Qingqiang king, who only had a title, could maintain the incense. When His Royal Highness changed the itinerary, the old Taoist priest, Wei Shuyang, was quite emotional. When he was young, he lived on a peak in the back of the mountain. However, he was not the kind of person who admired Taoism when he was young. After all kinds of discouragement, he became a Taoist priest. He had some feelings for Qingqiang Mountain, but not deep. He was very angry about the Qingqiang king's expulsion of the 9 pecks of rice sect. If it were not for the important task of protecting His Royal Highness, he would have come to Qingqiang Mountain to argue with the Taoist priest who was crowned king. Qingqing Mountain was known for its fog. An hour after entering the mountain, the dusk seemed particularly heavy. Su Fengyin was not in a hurry to let Lu Qiantang find a place to rest at night. He rode on the white horse leisurely. Yu Yue listened to the old Taoist priest, Wei Shuyang, introduce the scenery of Qingqing Mountain along the way. She was not worried about eating and sleeping in the open. Back then, hundreds of thousands of people fled from the imperial city of West Chu. She and her father were wrapped in the torrent. What kind of suffering had they not suffered? Back then, Su Fengyin heard that there was a heavenly paradise on the mountain that was ranked very high in Taoism. That was why he left the mountain on the official road. In the end, in broad daylight, he encountered a group of bandits who cut the path. One ran while the other ran. It was really embarrassing. As Su Fengyin thought about it, the corners of his mouth curled up. If he did not know that old Huang was Jianjiu Huang, he probably would not have known that this guy with missing front teeth who loved drinking yellow wine was a master. At that time, Su Fengyin was riding on horseback, but old Huang was carrying his luggage and running wildly under the horse. He was not slow at all. If he was an ordinary person with a thin and weak body, how could he have the strength to run half the mountain with the horse? Why did he not think of it at that time? Su Fengyin came back to his senses. Relying on his memory, he looked at the familiar scenery and said with a smile, Lu Qiantang, one li up the mountain, there is an abandoned Taoist temple. Go and investigate it first. Lu Qiantang accepted the order and left. The mountain was dark and wet, and Yu Yue was a little cold. She hugged Wu Mainyang tightly. Su Fengyin glanced at her and said gently, Tonight, you and Jiang and I will sleep in the carriage. Yu Yue's expression was complicated. She lowered her eyes and looked at Wu Mainyang, who raised her head. Not long after, Lu Qiantang returned and said respectfully, Reporting to your highness, there is indeed an abandoned Taoist temple. There are no miscellaneous people. Su Fengyin nodded. He turned his head and ordered Yang Qingfeng, Go and catch some game. Yang Qingfeng's figure jumped and disappeared into the dense forest. The horse continued to move forward meekly. The Taoist temple was still the same Taoist temple. It was just that it was even more dilapidated than before. Lu Qiantang picked up some firewood and started a fire in the courtyard. Tonight, the 3 of them naturally had to take turns guarding the temple. If Xu Xiu was unwilling, Lu Qiantang would not haggle over such trivial matters. The Pillar of Degua was too lazy to say which of the 3 retainers of the prince's mansion was higher or lower. His Royal Highness also did not say anything. It was as if he wanted the three of them to compete on their own. As for who was stronger and who was weaker, it was hard to say. Lu Qiantang was 100 times more confident in the Scarlet Cloud sword in his hand. However, he was not blindly conceited. Against the red-armored talisman general, Xu Xiu's internal energy could not be underestimated. Yang Qingfeng's treacherous methods were even more unpredictable. Taking a step back, so what if they competed? The maidservant that His Royal Highness called Bluebird made her move today had already shocked him. Yang Qingfeng caught several pheasants and wild rabbits. He was even carrying a wild muntjac. However, His Royal Highness was only interested in the pheasants. He smiled and said, "This is a specialty of Mount Qingsheng, white fruit pheasants. They grow by pecking on white fruits. The fragrance of their meat is even more excessive than that of the muntjac. You'll know when you taste it. The premise is that this Shitsi is able to control his mouth and not swallow it all." There was a clear spring at the back of the Taoist temple. Bluebird and Su Fengyan, who had been ordered around by him, skinned and washed the pheasants together. In order to plan for the long term, Su Fengyan had Bluebird teach him step by step how to control the heat of the ginger, which could even scorch a roasted goose. Su Fengyan sat on the steps. The two long and short sabers embroidered with winter and spring thunder were stacked on top of each other on his lap. Yu Wei, who did not bring many personal belongings with her, did not want to sit on the ground and dirty her clothes. Holding Wu Mainyang, she stood next to Su Fengyan. On the other hand, the old sword god was lying on his back on the highest step, using a blue stone he had casually picked up as his pillow. Yang Qingfeng was feeding the horses outside the courtyard. Xu Xiu and Lu Qianang were standing guard at the entrance to the courtyard, one on the left and one on the right. Su Fengyan waited for the delicious food to enter his mouth, then turned his head and pointed to a towering mountain in the distance, saying softly, "On the top of that mountain is the Qingyang Palace. On a clear night after the rain, you can see the wonders of thousands of lanterns facing the heavenly court. But I have only heard about it from Huang and have never seen it with my own eyes. Years ago, I was robbed at the foot of the mountain and almost died of exhaustion. In a panic, I rode a horse into a forest path and was knocked down by a low-hanging branch. So I was tied up and brought here with Huang. Fortunately, it was a close call, but a blessing in disguise, and I tasted half of a white fruit chicken. It seems that I was merciful enough to give Huang, who suffered with me, a drumstick or half a drumstick. In short, he was so grateful that he was crying and snot. I laughed to death." Yu Wei, however, saw that His Royal Highness, who had laughed to death, did not laugh at all. Chapter 115. While they were eating, Su Fengyan and Wei Shuyang each talked about some strange anecdotes of Mount Qingsheng. Yu Wei listened attentively while the old god of swords just wolfed down his food. Although Jiang and I was quite fond of Mount Qingsheng, he said that there were many celestial mountains in western Shu. Just Mount Amei, which was higher than the West Pole, was enough to suppress all the famous mountains in the world. Su Fengyan, on the other hand, said that there were continuous snowy mountains in western regions that were higher than both Mount Amei and Mount Qingsheng. It was just that scholars and poets did not have the ability to see it with their own eyes. Jiang and I said that Su Fengyan was just talking nonsense, but Old Man Li vaguely said that the snowy mountains in western regions were indeed much higher than Mount Amei. Mount Lantua claimed that it was 3 times the height of Mount Amei, which was already the highest among the 5 sacred mountains. And this was still a modest statement. Only then did Jiang and I lose his temper. Yu Wei asked softly, "Do you want to give some to the Phoenix Battalion?" Su Fengyan, who was gnawing on a white fruit chicken, used his greasy finger to point at Lu Qiantang and the other 2 who could only eat at the door. He said flatly, "It's strenuous and unrewarding to give these people some small favors. Let's not talk about the Phoenix Battalion. These 3, if you don't give them what they yearn for even in their dreams, even if you put 10,000 roasted white fruit chickens in front of them, they'll only think it's disgusting." Yu Wei said softly, "But it's always good to be approachable." Su Fengyan laughed and said, "That's because you haven't stayed in the Bailiang army. That's why you can say that. Let's not talk about others." Su Zhao's prestige was earned by taking the lead and risking his life time and time again. In the later stages of the chaotic war of spring and autumn, the late emperor specially decreed that Su Xiao was not to personally charge into enemy lines. Do you know how many of Beiliang's top generals died for Su Xiao? Wang Jian, the peerless hero who was known as the giant spiritual official of the heavenly court, and 2 others before him were all dead. Now, Qi Danghua, who was carrying the banner of Beiliang, had scars on his body. Even an old soldier who had been through hundreds of battles would be shocked to see him. Su Xiao himself had said that it was the will of the heavens that he was able to live until today. It was the heavens that did not want him to die. Giving people a small profit, if the operation is done properly, of course it can be exchanged for a big profit. But no matter what, it can't be exchanged for people's death and loyalty. Whether it's Jianghu martial artists like Lu Qianang or the Beiliang elites like the Phoenix Battalion, if I wanted to give their lives to me, hey, it's still too early. Yu Wei, who was squatting in front of the bonfire and warming herself up, felt a chill for no reason. His Royal Highness hadn't even exchanged a few words with them, and he was already thinking about how to cheat them of their lives in the future. As if he had guessed Yu Wei's thoughts, Su Fengyin said self-mockingly, "Do you think they're idiots? If I say, hey, take out your lives, will they really obediently hand it over?" The name His Royal Highness can only frighten people and tempt some petty people who seek profit. If I'm an empty bag of idiots, in the end, at most I'll just be a prodigal hedonist. Yu Wei, there's no harm in telling you something you don't know. Just now, when we went up the mountain and looked down from above, did we see any torches from the cavalry on the small path at night? I don't think so, because the Phoenix Battalion's light cavalry was the best in both night and field battles in the Beiliang army. The martial arts books said that cavalry had 10 victories, 9 defeats, and 8 losses. Logically speaking, the dense forest was the cavalry's place of defeat. But if anyone really thought that the 100 Phoenix Battalion soldiers couldn't stop 3 paces after going up the mountain, then they were purely looking for trouble. The Phoenix Battalion's warhorses went from horse identification, breeding, feeding, training, then to horseshoes, stirrups, saddles, and armor, and finally to choosing a formation with the same jumping speed, diligently riding, archery, and matchmaking between men and horses. There couldn't be any mistakes in every step. When a warhorse died in battle, it wasn't allowed to be eaten. It could only be cut off its ears and hooves to report to the horse supervisor. Those who violated the rules would be severely punished by military law. This was just a microcosm of the Beiliang army. Su Xiao managed the army and was clear about rewards and punishments. Before the battle, he never asked for great merits, only that he didn't make any mistakes. In the end, it was only a battle to the death, and still a battle to the death. This was the biggest and only characteristic of Su Zhao's army. Even he, the great general, dared to take the lead. So how could the 300,000 cavalry not be afraid of defeat and not refuse to fight to the death? The 4 great generals of the spring and autumn period, it seemed that another 4 appeared a few years ago. Who could be like Su Xiao, who could make the lowest level of soldiers willing to fight to the death? Yu Wei, tell me again, is it good or bad for me to take a leisurely stroll around the famed mountains with a beauty like you and take the time to give a little favor to the Phoenix Battalion? Yu Wei was so shocked that she couldn't speak. Su Fengyin wiped his hands on Yu Wei's clothes and said with a smile, "Don't feel bad. In a few days, when we reach the big cities in the county, we'll change out of our old clothes. Also, when did you tear off the ribbon that was tied to your chest? Such a magnificent scenery, yet you want to hide it. Why do you think it's too big and that sword dance won't look good? Wrong, it's big. Only sword dance will have spirit. With each wave, won't the domineering sword intent come out? No matter how beautiful a woman is, she will feel ashamed of her inferiority when she sees you. What I say under the bed is the truth." Perhaps it was because His Royal Highness had jumped too much when he spoke. Yu Wei didn't run away bashfully for a while. She just hugged Wu Meinyang and stared blankly. The old god of swords laughed exaggeratedly and said, "These words have a bit of wisdom. This old man is very pleasing to the ears." Jiang and I unconsciously sneaked a glance at Yu Youwei's tightly wrapped, full breasts. Then he lowered his head to look at himself. He seemed to be somewhat discouraged. Lu Qiantang entered the courtyard and said softly, "Your Highness, there's an enemy attack. There are more than 30 people, but they're all bandits in the forest." As long as His Royal Highness gave the order, Lu Qiantang could make these bandits, who had found the King of Hell, die without knowing how. Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Let them all in." Lu Qiantang and Yang Qingfeng, who looks more like a ghost than a ghost, don't show yourselves. Be careful not to scare them. Yang Qingfeng can go inform Mingame to stay put and wait for orders. Shu Xiao, you stay behind. More than 10 burly men noisily rushed into the courtyard. The remaining half could only squeeze at the door and look around. They had all followed the light of the fire. Nowadays, it was rare for them to encounter a big fat sheep. There were very few pilgrims, but today's group simply made them laugh. They widened their eyes and looked over. They almost all swallowed their saliva at the same time. The young nobleman sitting on the steps in the middle looked like the son of an official. At the very least, he was a child from Yongzhou. As for the disheveled old man and the old Taoist who were lying down and eating meat, they didn't pay any attention to them. However, the remaining people were all stunning beauties. The plump lady holding the white cat had a very good figure. Even a fairy couldn't compare to her. The little girl dressed as a servant girl who was roasting meat had an even more beautiful face. Her legs were closed together in an alluring manner, leaving no gap. Young chick. In front of him stood an older lady who looked like a vixen. What was a scholar saying? That's right, charming. At the door, the men who were slightly weaker, so they waved flags and shouted battle cries instead of rushing to kill and rob were about to go crazy. They pushed and shoved with all their strength. The shorter ones began to jump around, hoping to take a few more glances. How could such a beautiful and delicate lady withstand a few rounds from the first and second masters? Would it be their turn to have a taste? The 3 people in the courtyard had never been lucky enough to see her in their entire lives, let alone touch or even press her down. If the masters of the house took her as their mistresses, wouldn't they be done for? If it weren't for the nobleman from a rich family, the ox-nosed Taoist priest, and the skinny old man who wore a sheepskin fur coat, they would have thought that a fairy had descended to the mortal world. The first master, who was holding a pair of rusty Xianxia axes, sneered and said, "Don't you know the Yinyang Pavilion on Mount Qingcheng?" Su Fengyan looked ignorant and said, "I know. Under the pavilion is the world of the living, and under the pavilion is the world of the dead. The climate is completely different. In the past, when I was in this Taoist temple, I heard people say that even if there was a thunderstorm under the mountain, it would still be sunny on the mountain." The second master was a wretched man who looked like a monkey and was even skinnier than the old god of swords. He was born to be irritable. He jumped forward and reached out to touch Shu Xiao's chest with his dirty claws. Poor Shu Xiao didn't know His Royal Highness's intention. She could only pretend to be frightened and took 2 small steps back, just in time to avoid the monkey's vomiting hand. Unfortunately, Shu Xian was the outsider with the least status in this courtyard. She was so close to them that not only did she smell the sweat of this group of bandits and barbarians, she also smelled the terrifying armpit odor of that skinny monkey. Looking at His Highness the Heir Apparent, Shu Xian felt a little helpless. She could only hope that His Highness the Heir Apparent would stop playing with cats and monkeys as soon as possible. She was really unwilling to stand in the same courtyard as them. She did not lose some of the witchcraft that she had to be proficient in as a witch in her previous life, so it was really easy for her to deal with them until they wished they were dead. She threw some of the specially bred 5 poisons into their abdomen, nibbling away at their internal organs bit by bit, or reversing their meridians until their entire body boiled and exploded. Weren't their minds filled with obscenity? She had a kind of aphrodisiac with her, but she did not use it on them as a kind of bodhisattva. Instead, she threw it to wild beasts like the Bear King and the Monkey King. Su Fengyan hugged Yu Youwei and rubbed his stubbled chin on her smooth cheek. He asked with a smile, "Then are you robbers?" When this naive question came out, even Jiang and I felt embarrassed. Chapter 116. Su Fengyan looked at Annie Shu who was trying her best to suppress her killing intent and pretended to be shy and flustered. She was an old lady in her 30s, so it was not wrong to call her Andy, right? Su Fingyan did not kill according to her wishes. He still held Yu Yue's small waist, which was soft and smooth to the touch. In terms of waist slender, Jiang Yan'ai was not inferior to Yu Yue in his arms. However, Su Fingyan was lucky enough to see Yu Yue's chest on the bed. In comparison, her small waist seemed to be very small. Su Fingyan just pointed at Xu Xiao and teased, "Heroes, if I hand over this beauty and let you love her, will you let us go?" The headmaster, who was holding 2 Xianhua axes and wearing a tiger fur coat, glanced at Xu Xiao. Usually, with such a rare beauty in front of him, everything would be easy to deal with. However, a man who is not content is like a snake trying to swallow an elephant. The other 2 in the courtyard were obviously more delicious than the one closest to him. Even the most beautiful and arrogant Taoist nuns in the Qingyang Palace were not half as good as them. The headmaster had been on the mountain for 2 months, and he was about to suffer internal injuries from holding back his evil desire. He was just short of finding a female monkey to have fun. The county governor went into the mountain to kill people every time, but there were many wanted posters of the big and small mountain kings in Qingqing posted in the county. He was one of them, so he could only risk being beheaded and occasionally disguise himself as a villager to relieve his lust in the city. Therefore, the first master, who could not wait to tear apart the girls' clothes to reveal their fair skin, spat out a mouthful of thick phlegm and viciously cut the girl holding the white cat. He loved this girl the most. Although the face of the female servant who was roasting meat was more beautiful, she was still a girl. She still needed to have more meat to withstand the whip of the big axe under her grandfather's crotch. The first master, who shared the good fortune, pointed at Yu Yue with an axe, turned his head, and said with a smile, "This one belongs to me. No one can touch her. As for the rest, do as you see fit. Remember, don't torture her to death. Wash her clean and send her in my room." The third master was a down-and-out scholar. He had a belly full of evil tricks. In the beginning, he had tricked the girl to use the pretense of burning incense in Mount Qingcheng to force himself on her in a sparsely populated place. Although he was careful, there was a careless mistake, and he bumped into this group of bandits. He immediately sent the girl to his mouth with both hands. In a fit of anger, he became a bandit and gave advice to the 2 masters. Later, the girl could not bear to be humiliated one after another and hanged herself to death. Because he had not played enough, he was so angry that he did not even let go of the corpse. Taking advantage of the warm body, he tossed and turned for the time it took to burn a stick of incense. Even the first master and second master were endlessly impressed. In a moment of happiness, they made him the third master. The third master stared at Jiang and said with a gloomy smile, "This little sister belongs to me. I will take her back and train her well. Don't be afraid. I am a cultured person who has studied. I know how to dote on people." Only Xu Xiao was left. The skinny second master sourly said, "That year, the girl who was tricked into going up the mountain died. She was thrown down a cliff to feed the wild dogs." Su Fingyan snapped his fingers and asked, "I remember that this used to be Old Man Meng's territory. How come it changed you guys?" The first master said with disdain, "That trash who did not even dare to kill people has long been driven away. Don't talk nonsense. Come out and accept your death. It is only a matter of Grandpa's axe." Su Fingyan let go of Yu Yue and stood up with his saber. The first master looked at this posture and was stunned for a moment. Then he laughed wildly and said, "Boy, you still dare to play with your saber in front of Grandpa." Su Fingyan lightly jumped down the stairs. His movements were graceful and untainted by smoke and fire. It was obvious that his inner strength was not ordinary. Seeing that the head of Xianhua Hua's flower axe was a little dumbfounded, he kindly reminded him, "Look behind you." The first master did not dare to turn around for fear of being sneakily attacked by this boy. He only turned his head and took a quick glance. What? Other than the second master and the third master, why was there only an unfamiliar girl in green standing? Why were all the brothers lying on the ground? The girl in green, who was more graceful than a handsome scholar, was holding a strong brother by the neck and hanging him in the air? These brothers were all pinched to death like this? The expressionless girl in green loosened her grip, and the dead brother fell limply to the ground without making a sound. Xianxia, who had been waiting for this moment until the end of time, shot out a kick. She did not hit the skinny second master's body. Instead, she saw the skinny second master's body being hit by a huge force. He bent like a bow and then flew out with a bang. His whole body was embedded in the wall. A circle of blood spread out evenly on the wall. It was like a mosquito that was slapped to death. After killing him with one kick, Xianxia reached out and combed her black hair behind her ear. She sneered and said, "Even if I hit you, I don't want to dirty you." The first master's Xianxia hatchet trembled violently in his hand. He did not dare to retreat. The girl in green looked like a female Yama who killed people without batting an eye. And the one who killed the second master, her internal energy that could kill people without touching, was extremely terrifying. He did not dare to go forward. The old Taoist priest, who had always been calm and composed, looked like an old immortal of Mount Xianxia now. As for the elegant young master who made him jealous and hated him, was he also a difficult person to deal with? Could it be that he was going to die here today? With a thud, the third master, who was the most proficient in judging the situation, knelt on the ground and cried for his father and mother, begging for mercy. Su Fengyin only asked a question that confused people. Old Meng and his people are dead? The first master, whose life was hanging by a thread, quickly bowed and said, No, I have been friends with Old Meng for more than 10 years. I just asked him to change his territory with me. Chapter 117. Su Fengyin made an O sound, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He instructed, Lu Qiantang, take these two out. Be quick about it. Their howling and wailing in the middle of the night is like a ghost. Also, Yang Qingfeng, you know a lot of unorthodox methods. I'll leave these corpses to you. Remember to move them further away and sleep beside the pile of corpses. I'm afraid that someone will be on tenterhooks for the whole night and won't have the energy to study and earn money the next day. Seeing the corpses, Jiang and I, who had already hidden behind the old god of swords, turned pale and did not have the time to refute. When Yu Wei was still Lu Qiantang, she was indifferent to life and death. Naturally, she was much calmer than Jiang and I. Su Fengyin did not even look at Lu Qianeng as he left the courtyard with one person in each hand. He only said to Blue Bird, "Bring me a brush and ink, then follow me out. I have some things to draw. Grandpa Wei, I'll have to trouble you to accompany me to the Yinyang Pavilion with a wide view." The old Taoist priest Wei Shuyang stroked his beard and smiled. His Royal Highness is too polite. Coincidentally, I also missed that pavilion. When I followed my master to Mount Xianxia to cultivate when I was young, I rested there. Bluebird and the old Taoist priest each held a torch as they led the way. Su Fengyin held a knife of high-quality rice paper that he had squeezed out from Jin Sanlang. The brush in Bluebird's hand was not the same as usual. It was the hardest and sharpest brush in Guangdong's Liaowei. Looking at the back of the three people, Jiang and I then looked at Yang Qingfeng, who was digging out the dead person from the wall and dragging it out of the courtyard. Presumably, the two bandits that were carried out by the swordsman Lu Qiantang like chickens and ducks were also unable to escape death. Jiang and I, who was hiding behind Li Chungang, was in a daze. The old sword god had seen many vicissitudes of life. When he was young, he was also frivolous, so he was not unfamiliar with women's thoughts. He laughed and said, "Little Jiang, this old man has to say a few good words for little Su. You didn't accuse His Royal Highness of being unrestrained in Baoyang. However, outside of Baoyang, some of his methods cannot be said to be vicious and merciless. Today, these 30 people could be killed or not. It was all up to little Su. In the end, this old man guessed that it was the little bandit Old Meng who had yet to show himself." Jiang and I made a lukewarm sound of "oh." The old sword god smiled and said, "Little Jiang, do you want to know why that little brat took the brush and ink out? If you roast another white fruit chicken for this old man will tell you." Jiang and I said unhappily, "I don't want to know." Old Man Li was someone who could not hide his words. With great difficulty, he swallowed the words that were at the tip of his tongue and said, "Let's not talk about it. Otherwise, you will be frightened by this little brat's shrewdness and won't dare to practice the sword." Inyang Pavilion. With this as the boundary, below the mountain was the world of the living, and above the mountain was the world of the dead. It made sense. Wouldn't those bandits who had barged into the courtyard become lonely souls in the world of the dead? Su Fengyin took a wooden board made by Blue Bird and sat down cross-legged. He spread the rice paper on top of it. Blue Bird wanted to grind the ink, so Wei Shuyang held 2 torches to light the way. With the help of the moonlight, he looked at the Qingcheng mountain range in the distance. Qingcheng Mountain was very outstanding in the history of Taoism. It was the location of the 5th paradise, which was more advanced than the ancestral courts of the 2 great orthodoxies, Mount Longhu and Mount Wudong. The Taoist temple in the mountain was hidden in the green mountains and clear waters. The architecture was most compatible with the heavenly way. There was once a poem written by Immortal Chengwan that said, "I only love the peak of the father-in-law mountain. The steps of the pill ladder are close to the netherworld." The main peak, Qingyang Peak, and the secondary peak, Tianzuan Peak, were opposite each other. There was an iron chain bridge that hung horizontally. Yellow cranes soared and the sea of clouds rolled. It was indeed a rare scenery in the world. Wei Shuyang had once mustered up his courage to walk across the iron chain bridge. It took him a full hour to walk. When he finally reached Tianzuan Peak, his legs were weak and his clothes were soaked. Wei Shuyang looked down and praised sincerely, "His Royal Highness has a good memory." Su Fengyin concentrated on painting the mountains, rivers, and topography of Bailiang in detail. He was even more accurate than the senior officials of the geography department. Even a knowledgeable old man like Wei Shuyang was dumbfounded. His Royal Highness painted for an hour and changed more than 10 sheets of rice paper. Finally, he painted Mount Qingcheng. His Royal Highness was only riding on a horse. He didn't look at the scenery, but the shape of the mountains was even clearer than that of an old Taoist who had been cultivating in Mount Qingcheng for nearly 10 years. It was especially suitable for him to paint with fine hairs. Wei Shuyang had seen his Royal Highness grow up, so he was far more familiar with Su Fengyin's character than outsiders. It was true that he was naughty and mischievous. Otherwise, he wouldn't have ridden on Wei Shuyang's neck and peed. When he pooped in the tide-listening pavilion as a child, he would casually wipe his ass with a secret manual. However, once this child became serious, he would have a stubborn spirit. Once, he was punished by Li Yishan on the top floor to copy scriptures. His Royal Highness didn't admit his mistake, but he still copied the scriptures. In a fit of pique, he copied nearly 300,000 words. In the end, even the Great Pillar State came forward to plead for leniency. In the end, he won over Li Yishan, who didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Su Fengyin stopped writing and waited for the ink to dry. He looked up and smiled at Bluebird. "Later, take these rice papers back to the carriage and sleep. Otherwise, that girl won't dare to close her eyes." When the rice paper finished eating the ink, Bluebird took the paper and brush and left. The torches had been changed several times. Su Fengyin shook his wrist and laughed softly. "Grandpa Wei, don't let anyone know that I'm drawing this." The old Taoist nodded. "Of course. His Royal Highness has a beautiful heart. I've seen it and kept it in my heart. I won't say anything." Su Fengyin looked at the highest peak of Mount Qingcheng in the distance and said self-deprecatingly, "His Royal Highness has a rotten heart." "What kind of beautiful heart does he have?" Wei Shuyang laughed. "His Royal Highness is too modest." Su Fengyin closed his eyes and faced the beautiful mountains. He folded his blade on his knees and formed the Huangting incantation with 2 fingers. He silently entered a meditative state. Wei Shuyang didn't sleep the whole night. He just sat quietly and observed His Royal Highness's mysterious phenomenon. There was a purple aura coming from the east between his eyebrows. The closer it was to dawn, the more the red date mark between Su Fengyin's eyebrows turned from dark red to light purple. When the first rays of the morning sun shone on his body, Su Fengyin slowly opened his eyes and turned to look at Wei Shuyang apologetically. Wei Shuyang stroked his white beard and shook his head. I'm looking forward to His Royal Highness going to Longhu. Chapter 118. Today's reward was very generous. Disciple, Ming-She, and Zhou Zhaoqin, thank you for your support along the way. Su Fengyin took a deep breath of the mountain forest and felt refreshed. He joked, Grandpa Wei, are there really immortals who eat clouds and drink dew? Do you think there are immortals who eat the essence of the sun and moon in the Qingyang Palace? The old Taoist chuckled and said, I have never heard of such immortals. My master only knew some Dharma access to fasting and essence. He is far from the immortal realm. Su Fengyin left the pavilion and looked up at the Qingyang Heavenly Lord's twin peaks that looked like a pair of bullhorns. He muttered to himself, the Qingcheng King sounds very powerful. The Taoist master of Mount Longhu is only a state teacher who is in charge of all Taoism. Mount Wudong is even more pitiful. The Wudong sect leader is nothing, but there is someone who occupies a mountain and calls himself king. Wei Shuyang smiled, but did not say anything. Because of his high status, he had been friends with His Royal Highness for more than 10 years. Therefore, when he traveled with Su Fengyin on the horse, he knew about the farce of two geese swapping yellow gates. Now that he saw His Royal Highness drawing with the geography of the mountains and rivers, it was very likely that he would draw wherever he went. Was he not going to draw 3,000 miles of beautiful mountains and rivers in a single line? Would there be any hidden secrets in this path? Old Taoist Zhudami did not dare to delve deeper. He just kept it in his heart. The more he spoke, the more likely he would make mistakes. Almost all the scholars in Bailiang had their tongues pulled out by the Great Pillar State. No one dared to talk about the military and politics of the border. They only knew how to recite poems and couplets. However, there were a few poets who had the courage to join the military. In recent years, there were many bold and powerful famous poems that attracted the wanderers who wanted to become famous to join the military. Interestingly, many foppish young masters were tortured half to death by His Royal Highness and felt that they could not make it big. In a fit of anger, they went to the border to fight for military achievements. At least there was no His Royal Highness to suppress them at the border. In the Taoist temple, Su Fengyin saw the haggard Jiang Ni with red and swollen eyes. He could not help but smile. This girl's courage was not worth mentioning. Her only magnificent feat in this life was to kill him, right? Yu Yue slept much more soundly. Her eyes were clear, as if she had understood some things that she did not understand in the past. Her gaze toward His Royal Highness was much clearer and less cloudy and gloomy from her self-reproach. Su Fengyin could not be bothered with these minor details. He ate his breakfast carelessly and found the old god of swords, who was standing with his hands behind his back. The old man was staring at an old couplet with blurry handwriting. Su Fengyin lowered his voice and said, There are some new things in the box of books in the carriage. If you have to escape in the future, I'll have to trouble you to bring the box along with Jiang and I. The old god of swords said lazily, It depends on this old man's mood. Su Fengyin secretly bared his teeth. Seeing that the old god of swords was going to watch him and Lu Qiantang exchange blows, he did not criticize the old man for being a hero past his prime. Su Fengyin couldn't help but grimace when he saw the old man, who used to be one of the top figures in Jianghu, stretch out his arm to scratch his crotch. Old Sword Godly, Grandpa Wei said that you used to be single and unrestrained in Jianghu, and that no one could compare with your green robe and sword. There were also countless outstanding women who had unrequited love for you. But you're acting like this now. Is it true that you didn't come from random flattery? It was indeed wise not to tell Grandpa Wei that this old man was Li Chungang. As soon as the old man scratched his crotch, he stretched out his hand to brush his yellow teeth. His teeth were stained with shredded meat from the meat he ate last night. He gently flicked it away. Su Fengyin, who had seen everything, silently walked away, cursing in his heart. F***CK, this earth soared immortal. Following the road around the mountain, they passed by the two peaks of the mountain gate of Qingsheng and arrived at the mountainside of Canopy Peak. From the two sides of the dense forest came a burst of noise mixed with cursing and pushing. The sturdy LV Qiantang stopped his horse and squinted his eyes to look. This man with a huge sword, red afterglow, sat upright on a tall and sturdy horse. Looking at the group of His Highness the heir apparent from the layman's perspective, the swordsman LV Qiantang might only be slightly weaker than the halberd Ningame. This burly swordsman from Dongyue was undoubtedly able to intimidate the little rats. Lu Qiantang saw a thin and weak young man with a yellow face being pushed out of the forest and stumbling on the road, falling flat on his face. However, this young man did not speak to Lu Qiantang's group of people. Instead, he turned around and scolded, "Lu Reed, I'm not going to let your wife off tonight. Why did you push me? I don't have the strength to climb the wall to see you lying on your wife's body. You could have pushed anyone else, but you pushed me out. Let's see if I don't expose the fact that you touched a big girl's breasts in the market last month." Lu Qiantang looked at him coldly and slowly drew out his giant sword. A hoarse voice sounded in the dense forest. "Little bastard, are you looking for death? Why aren't you running? The wind is strong. Let's go." It seemed that this group of robbers was much weaker than those from last night, but their eyesight was much better. The most amusing thing was that the young man stared dumbfoundedly at Yu Wei, Xianxia, and Bluebird. Before he ran away, he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Sisters, you're even prettier than the immortal ants of Qingyang Temple." Yu Wei raised the corner of her mouth. This little thief was much cuter than those unlucky villains from yesterday. His Royal Highness rode out and slapped Lu Qiantang's hand with the embroidered winter saber. Yu Wei was very surprised, but it was a kind of joy from the bottom of his heart. His Royal Highness carried the embroidered winter saber on his shoulder and laughed. "Little Hawthorne?" The young man was about to run into the dense forest, but he suddenly stopped and looked back at the strange young man on the horse. He only felt that the young man looked familiar, but he didn't know such a rich young man. "What? Oh my God, did I get on the list of bandits in the city? It can't be. We have the lowest status among the dozens of bandits in Mount Xianxia." Even the head Meng was not qualified to have his portrait posted on the city wall. Because of this, the head Meng was very angry. He always said that he was the first bandit king of Mount Xianxia. Why didn't he get on the list? "My old Meng has also kidnapped several wives and daughters of officials in the county. Didn't he just let them go after taking some money? Did he look down on us?" The young man, who was nicknamed Little Hawthorne by his Royal Highness, was stunned for a moment. He stared at him for a while, and then said uncertainly, "Su Fengnian?" His Royal Highness narrowed his eyes and pursed his lips. Xu Xiao, who was very picky, was dazed for a moment. His Royal Highness was really charming. Not to mention a mature woman in her 30s like her. It could be said that women between 10 and 80 years old would be attracted. Su Fengnian jumped off the horse and smiled. "Isn't it? It's only been 3 years, and you can't recognize me?" The young man was really a newborn calf who didn't know anything about the world. He didn't care about anything else and ran to Su Fengnian with a scream. He circled twice and excitedly reached out to touch Su Fengnian's saber and pulled the sleeves of Su Fengnian's brocade clothes. He was amazed and looked up to ask, "Su Fengnian, you are even more arrogant than last time. This time you're going to give money to Old Meng again?" Chapter 119. Su Fengnian didn't seem to mind that his clothes had been touched until they were dirty and dirty. He only used the embroidered dagger to knock the young man's head lightly and scolded with a smile. "Go away. Last time you guys robbed me. This time it's me who should rob you guys." More than 10 ragged thieves jumped out of the dense forest. None of them weighed more than 150 kilograms. They were all poor, old and young. Most of them were wearing their own woven straw sandals. A few of them had weapons in their hands, but they were only carrying wooden spears and sticks. Compared to the group that attacked the Taoist temple at night, there was a world of difference. The leader, Old Meng, was a skinny old man who weighed more than 100 kilograms. He rubbed his eyes and finally recognized that the young man was the Su Fengnian that he had chased half a mountain away. He then looked at the majestic retainers on horses in fear. He carefully took 2 steps forward and asked from afar, "Su Fengnian, let's make things clear first. You spent all your money in the past few years. I only have 1 life left. If you want to take it, take it. If you frown, I will change my surname to yours. Su Fengnian looked around. Little Hawthorne, the timid old Meng, Lulu, the man who loved his wife the most, Cripple Kong, and many other familiar faces were still there. They were all alive. Su Fengnian's smile was intoxicating. He hugged little Hawthorne's small body and said loudly, "Old man Meng, look at you. Even your stockade has been taken away by others, and you still want to pretend to be a hero in front of me. Damn you, don't pretend to be a fool in front of me. Go, pick a place near the water, and I'll take you guys to eat your fill." Old Meng timidly said, "Su Fengnian, did you become a bailiff in the government office? Do you want to wipe us out?" Su Fengnian glared at him and scolded, "Nonsense. I came here to enjoy the scenery and see if I could meet you. Before I went up the mountain, I was wondering if you had starved to death. Now, it seems that you are not far from it. You're the first master, and I feel ashamed for you." Old Meng's subordinates, Reed Pole, burst into laughter, making Old Meng, who has no dignity, feel very embarrassed. Old Meng smiled embarrassedly and said, "Hey, it's hard for a hero to stand out in this world. You little brat, your mouth is still unforgiving. Well, let's go." Yu Youwei's eyes widened, and Shu Xiu's charming face stiffened. Jiang Ni's little head peeked out from behind the curtain. He just couldn't understand what was going on. Old Meng led the way to a picturesque place near the water. There were a few shabby thatched huts, with some ragged clothes hanging on the bamboo poles. If this was considered as occupying a mountain and becoming a king, who in the world would be willing to be a bandit? Yang Qingfeng, who came and went like a ghost, came out with countless game animals. This group of bandits, who had worked hard to set 10 traps but still couldn't catch a single wild rabbit or pheasant, were drooling. Su Fengnian sat on a stone by the stream. Little Hawthorne lay behind him and hugged Su Fengnian's neck, ignoring Old Meng's enthusiasm. Su Fengnian teased, "Well, Old Meng, you're the leading hero of Mount Xianxia. What are you afraid of? Little Hawthorne is braver than you." Little Hawthorne laughed happily and said, "I told Old Meng to give me the position of the first master. How could he be willing to do that? He insisted on waiting for a few more years." Su Fengnian nodded and said with a smile, "He was lying to you. Did you really believe him? Why don't you come down the mountain with me? I'll take you to eat fish and meat every day." Little Hawthorne secretly turned to look at a few fairy sisters not far away and said, "Forget it. I grew up on this mountain. If I leave, Old Meng will die of grief." "But Su Fengnian, who are those sisters to you? They're so pretty. They're much prettier than little Kay, from Lu Wei's family." A young girl of 12 or 13 years old put her hands on her hips and said angrily, "What did you say, stupid Hawthorne?" Su Fengnian turned to look and said in surprise, "Little Kay, you're all big girls now. Come, stand closer and let Brother Su take a closer look." Little Hawthorne secretly told, "Su Fengnian, Kay likes you a lot. I've heard her talking in her sleep a few times." The little girl, whose skin was tanned by the sun, blushed. She must have accidentally seen Yu Youwei and the other girls and felt a little inferior and timid. She just stood far away and did not dare to get close to Su Fengnian. When she was young, Brother Su taught her to play a little tune with a leaf. She learned it for a long time, and now she had mastered it. When there was no one around, she would secretly play it a few times. He used to make a promise that he would come and see her when she grew up. Su Fengnian finally tricked the shy little Kay, to sit beside him. They ate Old Meng's best smoked and roasted game together. The little girl had really grown up. She knew how to chew slowly without showing her teeth. Su Fengnian saw that Old Meng's eyes were blank and full of fear. He frowned and asked, "Is there something on your mind, Old Meng? Tell me about it." Old Meng squeezed out a smile and shook his head. Little Hawthorne, who was chewing on a wild munch, could not hold back her words. Her eyes turned red and she said sadly, "Su Fengnian, we owe them money. If we can't pay them back, they will take Kay away. The last time they came, they tore down our house and said that if we can't pay them back in 2 days, they will make Kay their maid." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "It's okay. I'll help you pay them back. When you robbed me in the past, you said that I was one of the wealthiest young masters in the world." "It wasn't a lie." Old Meng said softly, "It's no use. We owe them more than 20 taels of silver. Furthermore, they are not after the money. They just want to take K.Er away. You know that daughters are more precious than anything else in the mountains. Lulu and I have discussed it. At most, we will fight with our lives on the line. When the time comes, we will let little Hawthorne take K.Er and escape down the mountain. Old bones like us won't be able to move, and we don't want to leave either. After all, we have been here for more than 20 years. We can't bear to leave. We're just waiting for the day when we die on the mountain. Su Fingyan, Old Meng knows that you have some silver, and I appreciate your kindness. However, those people are not kind people. They kill and burn without blinking. I don't know how many girls have been harmed by them. After you finish eating, you should leave quickly. It's best if you don't even want to stay on Mount Xianxia. It's not peaceful. Su Fingyan asked, "You owe the money. Was it the first master who used a pair of axes?" Old Meng said with lingering fear, "That's not the case. If it were those people, we would have died long ago. Old Meng would rather starve to death than borrow money from them." Sigh. A good man takes responsibility for his actions. Old Meng has been sloppy all his life. Fortunately, I still have these old brothers. Su Fingyan, Old Meng boldly asks you to take care of little Hawthorne and Ke. It's easy to feed poor children, but I beg you not to let them become slaves. When we went up the mountain, we still had the backbone of men. We can't live backward. Just don't let them starve to death. If you are willing, Old Meng will kowtow to you. I don't mind kneeling for this great kindness. Su Fingyan was expressionless. Old Meng looked bitter. Lu Qiantang bowed and said, "There are more than 10 new people." Su Fingyan made a cold gesture of cutting his throat. Old Meng was dumbfounded. Su Fingyan frowned and asked, "Mount Qianxia is so chaotic. Doesn't Prince Qianxia know how to do something about it?" Old Meng said bitterly, "Why would he care? Those immortals in Qingyang Palace don't care about the lives of ordinary people." Su Fingyan stood up and patted little Hawthorne's head. He then took Ke-Er's small hand that was not delicate at all and said with a smile, "I used to carry you on my back. Now that you are a girl, I can't carry you on my back anymore. Your father will fight me with a hoe. Let's go. Take Ke-Er to Qingyang Palace to see the immortals." Chapter 120. Su Fingyan held little Hawthorne in one hand and Ke-Er in the other as they walked away. Old Man Meng, who had been a bandit for more than 20 years, had mixed feelings. Back then, when he had brought his old brothers to see the master and servant touring Qianxia, even a blind person would know that they were a fat sheep dripping with oil. A dozen people had rushed up to intercept them. Old Man Meng had just said that as long as they had money, they would not hurt anyone. This timid young master had already fled on horseback. If he had not been unlucky enough to be knocked off his horse by a branch, he would have really run away in a panic. Old Man Meng could not do the immoral business of robbing money and killing people. Unexpectedly, he had accidentally found several large piles of banknotes and some strange books on this fat sheep. The group of old fellows were all dumbfounded. It turned out that this fat sheep had an extraordinary background. Without needing Su Fingyan to beg for mercy, Old Man Meng had taken the initiative to take a banknote worth 100 taels of silver and return the rest. It was not that Old Man Meng viewed gold and silver as dung. It was just that several groups of people on Mount Qianxia had robbed wealthy families and attracted the attention of hundreds of armored soldiers from the county's military office. Those who were unlucky had their lairs smashed, while those who were luckier had not been able to sleep soundly. Old Man Meng did not want to drag his group of brothers to the downtown area to be beheaded in public. After a while, they had gathered in the Taoist temple to eat some roasted game. The fat sheep and the grassland bandits had unexpectedly become familiar with each other. This fellow was not very courageous, but his skin was really as thick as a city wall. He had shamelessly stayed with them for half a day and was addicted to eating and drinking. Every day, he would lie about how he was a rich young master from Bailiang. Who would believe him? Did he think that he was the son of a noble family just because he had a few thousand taels of silver? Our Old Man Meng has seen the world. Later on, Old Man Meng kicked him down the mountain. We're doing a job with our heads hanging on our belts. What if we implicate the two good people, master and servant, in the process? This fellow had a good conscience. Before he went down the mountain, he had given an extra 100 taels of silver, saying that he would keep it for her to buy clothes and rouge when she grew up. However, business had been slow in the past 3 years. More than half of it had been extorted by a few little immortals from Qingyang Palace. Then he had been on good terms with a few groups of people in the same industry who had borrowed, but never returned the money. Half a year ago, he had had no choice but to borrow 30 taels of silver from Xianxia. Lu ran over with his head full of sweat. His lips were pale and trembling as he said, "Old man Meng, Xianxia and those bastards are all dead. They were all killed by that guy with the big sword." Old Lu was as thin as a reed pole, but he had married a wife who was heavier than both of them. Moreover, he had given birth to a little girl who was getting more and more beautiful as she grew up. Old Lu wiped his sweat and sat on the ground. He gasped for breath and said softly, "This swordsman is too overbearing. He killed several people with one strike. How many of them could they withstand? They were all dead. None of them had a whole corpse. Old man Meng, you are the smartest one among us. Think about it. Are we lucky or doomed? If we met Xianxia and his gang, we would have fought with our lives. However, Su Fingyin is a real person. If he holds a grudge against us, wouldn't it be like playing with us?" Old man Meng thought for a while and said bravely, "It's a good thing. Su Fingyin doesn't look like an official's son who kills people like flies. He really likes little Hawthorne and K.er. We can all see this. He can't be bad. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived." Lu Reed whispered, "What is the background of this Su Fingyin?" Old man Meng reached out and touched his back. It was wet. He shook his head and said, "How would I know?" Lu Reed was surprised. "Hey, what about the servant, old Huang?" Old man Meng said absent-mindedly, "Have you ever seen a servant who can run as fast as a horse? That's why I didn't dare to ask for more money." Lulu suddenly realized what was going on. He slapped his thin thigh and accidentally slapped it too hard. He sucked in a breath of cold air. Cripple Kong, who always liked to hide at the back of the group, ran with great momentum today, or rather, he pissed his pants in terror. This cripple used to like to jest with Su Fingyin, bragging about how he was more handsome than Su Fingyin when he was younger. Now his face was pale as he shouted, "There are people from the Yamen." With a rough glance, there were at least 100 people. They were all riding horses with sabers and crossbows. Compared to the officers and soldiers who went up the mountain to encircle and suppress them, the difference was like heaven and earth. Old Kong had served in the army before. He recognized the famous Bailiang sabers. They are Bailiang sabers. These 100 people can flatten the entire Mount Qingcheng, let alone us. Old man Meng and Lu Reed looked at each other. They could only wait for death. Fortunately, little Hawthorne and Kay were not here, so they could die without grievance. Who would have thought that when these 100 elite light riders arrived at the stream bank, their leader, a general in heavy armor and holding a halberd, took off his helmet and helmet. With a smile, he looked at old man Meng's group of rarely seen kind-hearted thieves and spoke as softly as possible. "This general is Ningame." His young master Su said not to disturb Mr. Meng. "It's just that our cavalrymen have always regarded the horses as their comrades. On the way up the mountain, we couldn't find a water source, so we had to break the rules and disturb you. Mr. Meng, please don't blame us." Old man Meng spoke with a thick Yongzhou accent. He was confused and asked, "What did the general say?" Ningame patted his ink-black beloved horse. He smiled and said, "The horse wants to drink water, so we took a break." Chapter 121. Old man Meng felt relieved and said, "General, you don't have to be polite. Drink as much as you want. You can even drink all the water in the stream." Ningame cupped his fists and turned around to say sternly, "Hold on tight for a stick of incense." The 100 light cavalry from the Phoenix Battalion didn't make any noise. Only the sound of the horses drinking and snorting could be heard. The Liang dynasty had always been recognized as the best war horses in the spring and autumn period. Their horse policy was flourishing, and the imperial court paid special attention to it. The martial arts books said that horses were important to the country. The other countries in the spring and autumn period either didn't pay attention or didn't have large pastures like West Chu. Northern Liang claimed to have 300,000 iron cavalry. Every war horse had to be recorded in detail from the moment it was born. There are almost complicated and harsh military rules and regulations. Anyone who cut off the horse's food was guilty of the same crime as cutting off the soldier's rations. They weren't allowed to ride horses to hunt outside of war. If they let someone ride them, they would be whipped 100 times. If they threw away the stirrup or saddle, they would be whipped 100 times. Ningame led 100 light cavalry out and had to strictly follow the most basic marching rules. They had to rest every 10 li and brush the horses' noses and mouths. They had to feed every 30 li. In Bailiang, anyone who lost their horse in battle would be executed. They would be rewarded for fighting to the death and injuring their horses. The Bailiang cavalry was the best in the world. It wasn't announced by the mouths of scholars, but by the horses trampling over the 6 countries and half of Jianghu. Cripple Kong, who had once done odd jobs in a drill ground in Yongzhou, had claimed to have joined the army before. He raised his voice and asked carefully, "General, are you from Bailiang?" Ningame smiled and said, "I'm not a general, but we are from Bailiang." Cripple Kong gave him a thumbs up and said, "Bailiang cavalry, there's nothing to say. When I was in the Yongzhou army, I heard a lot about the achievements of Bailiang's 300,000 iron cavalry. Today, I've finally seen it with my own eyes." Ningame smiled and didn't say anything. Cripple Kong squatted on the side and observed carefully. These 100 Bailiang cavalry were much stronger than the Yongzhou army. He estimated that 3 Yongzhou soldiers against 1 Bailiang would be difficult. Ningame waited for the war horses to finish drinking and put their armor back on and shouted, "Get on the horses!" More than 100 light cavalry mounted their horses. Their movements were exactly the same, as smooth as flowing water. Old Man Meng and the others were dumbfounded. They only felt that this group of Northern Liang cavalrymen had a strong, murderous aura just by mounting their horses. If they charged, who would dare to stop them? Lu watched as the Northern Liang light cavalry left in an orderly manner. He clicked his tongue and said, "Old Man Meng, I'm convinced. You're right. That Su Fingyan's father is an official. Maybe he's the son of a general." Cripple Kong nodded and said, "You're right." Lu Reed smiled and said, "You want more? Old Meng, why don't you just say that Su Fingyan is the son of the Great Pillar State? There's nothing more important than that, right?" "Huh? Su Fingyan? Doesn't that mean he has the same surname as the king of Bailiang?" The 3 of them stared at each other. Old Meng, who was almost choked to death, finally let out a sigh and whispered, "Doesn't look like it." Cripple Kong nodded and said, "Doesn't look like it." Lu Reed agreed and said, "Doesn't look like it at all." Qingyang Peak was steep and precipitous, like a sword pointing at the sky. As the saying goes, looking at a mountain is close to death. There is still a long way to go to reach the Qingyang Palace at the top of the mountain. Perhaps they could only reach the peak at night. Fortunately, the scenery along the way was picturesque. The ancient trees towered into the sky. The streams were deep and secluded, and the cliffs were carved with apes and monkeys. It was not boring at all. Many old people who believed in the way of the 9 bushels of rice would walk for 10 days with their own rations in order to burn incense at the top of Qingyang Peak. Su Fingyan and Little Hawthorne rode on the same horse. Yu Yue was carrying K.Er. The little girl liked the white cat Wu Meinyang very much, so she just happened to hold her in her arms. Su Fingyan raised his head and looked through the lush, ancient trees at the clouds and the sunset. It was as gorgeous as the ocean. Little Hawthorne held the embroidered winter saber that he had borrowed from Su Fingyan with both hands. He smiled and said, "If we go up a little more, we will reach the Jaiha Pavilion. I heard that it will take a few hours to reach the top by foot. It will take at most 2 hours by horse. In the past, Kerr and I only dared to walk to the edge of the pavilion. The fairy ants have bad tempers and will scold people." Su Fingyan asked, "Are there many female Kuan Taoists on the mountain?" Little Hawthorne was confused. "What?" Su Fingyan smiled and explained, "Female Taoists." Little Hawthorne nodded and made a face at Kerr. He smiled and said, "There are many. They are all prettier than Kerr, but they are not as pretty as the sisters you brought." Su Fingyin knocked the young man's head and smiled as he lectured him. Let me teach you a principle that I spent countless silver taels to buy. When you see a beautiful girl, you have to praise her with all your might. If she is not so beautiful, you have to praise her as extremely beautiful. If she is really ugly, you have to at least say that she is delicate and graceful. Little Hawthorne looked embarrassed and said, honestly, I can't learn this. Look at how black Kara is. I always say that she is as white as a piece of charcoal. Su Fingyin laughed and said, aren't you asking for a beating? Yu Youwei's lips curled up as she touched the little braids of the girl in her arms. Kara also snickered. She did not care who Su Fingyin was. She only remembered that Su Fingyin was the one who taught her how to blow the leaf whistle. He said that he would come to see her and would even take her to the Qingyang Temple to see the fairies. Chapter 122. Su Fingyin and his entourage got down from their horses to rest, but they did not even see a single pheasant. Instead, there were 6 or 7 female Kuindao Taoist crowns surrounding a young man with an imposing appearance. He was wearing a Taoist robe, holding a Xianxia-style peachwood sword with a fragrant wooden body. On his head was a much-criticized Xiaoyao headband decorated with a cloud pattern. Behind the hat, there were 2 long sword-head streamers, which swayed when he moved. However, the elderly Great Jinren and old Taoist priests all agreed that it was not dignified. Not every young Taoist priest had the courage to wear it. The female Taoist crowns were beautiful and delicate, making the young Taoist priest even more unrestrained. This handsome Taoist priest reclined on the bench in the pavilion, while several female Taoist crowns beside him were peeling off green goat chestnuts and putting them into his mouth. If such an immortal mansion was seen by old Meng and his gang of thieves, wouldn't it be the demeanor of an immortal? When a young Taoist priest of Qingyang Palace saw Xianxia, he was delighted at first, but when he saw Yu Youwei with a white cat and white dress, he was stunned. When he saw Jiang and I who jumped down from the carriage, he could not hide the amazement in his eyes. He gently pushed away the female Taoist crowns, stood up, hung the peachwood sword on his waist, and took the lead to walk out of the Zhokrain pavilion. He bowed elegantly and politely to the end. After raising his head, he stood still and looked at Su Fingyin with a smile, slowly saying, Qingyang Palace's little Taoist Wuxia. Su Fingyin would not give this Taoist priest a chance to boast. He let Lu Qianheng open the way and went straight to the Zhokrain pavilion. He rudely interrupted, Wuxia, who is Prince of Qingcheng Wulingsu to you? Those female Taoist priests originally had a good impression of Su Fingyin. In terms of appearance, His Highness the Crown Prince, who was not like Su Xiao but was 80% similar to the princess consort, was a rare combination of a man and a woman. If it weren't for the past 4 years of travel and the sharpening of the knife, which wiped off a lot of cosmetics, he would be more pleasing to women. Of course, compared to Wu Shizhen, he was more presentable. Although Su Fingyin's physique was stronger now, he was not as sharp and feminine as before, but his yin qi was more vigorous. So far, he was only inferior to Bai Hu Er's face. Although the female Taoist priests of Qingyang Palace were surprised by the handsomeness of the rich and luxurious man in front of them, they had been with Wu Shizhen for a long time and were used to speaking in a refined manner. They could not stand Su Fingyin's straightforwardness. Their faces immediately darkened. Where did this playboy come from? How dare he call Prince of Qingqing's name directly? Wu Shizhen glanced at Lu Qiantang and Xu Xiu, who were standing in a triangular formation. He could only see that Xu Xiu was a female fox with a soft body and charm on the inside. However, Lu Qiantang's red cloud sword seemed to be heavier than 10 peachwood swords added together. Wu Shizhen did not panic at all. He still greeted with a smile and calmly said, Palace Master is my father. Su Fingyin sneered. Then you have a powerful father. Prince of Qingqing. It sounds impressive. In our dynasty, there are only 2 princes with different surnames. You have reincarnated well. The female Taoist priests were all furious. They whispered and cursed. Obviously, they were annoyed by Su Fingyin's words. Wu Shizhen was indeed the son of Prince of Qingqing. He just chuckled and said, Judging from your accent, you are from Yangzhou? Su Fingyin nodded arrogantly. He was a playboy who claimed to be second in Bailiang, and no one dared to claim to be third, let alone first. He did not need to put in any effort to pretend. He naturally had a domineering arrogance that made people's scalps numb. He pointed at Wu Shizhen, who had been smiling obsequiously, and said arrogantly, "My father is not much worse than Prince of Qingqing. He is a general with a commander's seal. Over the years, he has accumulated a large amount of wealth. I feel that there's too much gold and silver in the house. I heard that there are immortals in Mount Qingcheng, so I want to see if I can buy some longevity methods and live 100 more years. If I can succeed, I can even move 100 kilograms of gold to Qingyang Palace, let alone 1,000,000 taels of silver. At the very least, I can go to Qingyang Palace and get some good books on the art of sex. You, Taoist priest Wu Shizhen, since you are the son of Wu Lingsu who was crowned as king, take me to Qingyang Palace at the top of the mountain. If your father does not have the ability to be king, I will tear down your Qingyang Palace." Wu Shizhen squinted at Wei Shuyang, who was dressed in Taoist robes of 9 pecks of rice. He said, "Please follow me up the mountain. I am not boasting, but there are some unique Taoist books in Qingyang Palace that seek longevity. Since you have brought the old Taoist immortal of 9 pecks of rice, you will know at a glance." Su Fengyin said arrogantly, "Then why don't you hurry up and lead the way? If I am satisfied, all the gold and silver will be yours." Wu Shizhen led a group of furious Qingyang Palace female Taoist priests on foot. He abandoned the bamboo recliner in the corner of the crane pavilion. Su Fengyin, who was riding on the horse, knocked Wu Shizhen's head with the scabbard of embroidered winter and asked, "Wu Shizhen, tell me how your father is an immortal." Chapter 123. Wu Shizhen was already drenched in sweat. He panted as he replied, "My father was originally a hermit at Mount Longhu's alchemy cliff. Later, he achieved great success in alchemy and went down the mountain to pray for help. He met Heavenly Lord Wang at the Yangtze River. Heavenly Lord Wang saw that my father's Tao heart was pure, so he gave him the great Tao of divine lightning, which could enslave 36 ghosts and gods. He then went to the 22nd grotto heaven of the Whitewater Hound Taoist sect and helped an old woman who was seriously ill. Only then did he know that she was the mother of lightning. He gave my father the divine firmament 5 lightnings heavenly book, which could summon thunder and lightning with a wave of his hand. My father received the mandate of heaven and was enlightened. He saw ghosts and gods, chanted spells, and commanded thunder and lightning to chase after evil demons. He was fortunate enough to be summoned by His Majesty, who was very pleased and conferred him the title of Prince of Qingqing. Su Fengyin was a little shocked. Although Wu Shizhen was panting like a bull, he was very familiar with his speech. It was obvious that he had recited it countless times. Wei Shuyang smiled slightly and did not comment. As a Taoist priest, how could he not know about the legends of immortals? For example, Mount Longhu and Mount Wudong. Other than the founding ancestors, they also needed to borrow the power of ghosts and gods to strengthen their reputation. How could any heavenly master or sect master meet an immortal when he went out? People would laugh their heads off if they heard about it. Jiang and I, who had poked his head out of the curtain and heard all this, believed it without a doubt. As for Wu Shizhen, he did not even look at him carefully. He did not know how he looked or how he was like. The old god of swords, Li Chungang, lowered his head and smelled the smell of his feet. He seemed to be disgusted by his own stench. He raised his head and waved his hand. "Don't listen to the nonsense of this overindulgent Taoist. It's all lies." Jiang and I was very respectful toward immortals and Buddhas. He said nervously, "Don't talk nonsense. We're not far from Qingyang Palace. Be careful of lightning." The old man laughed. "So what if it does? This old man will shatter it with one sword." Jiang and I, who was on tenterhooks, said angrily, "Will you die if you don't brag? Will you die?" The old man laughed. "Don't worry, listen. Su Fengyin, that brat. How would he let this little Taoist priest's endless bragging?" As expected, Su Fengyin was like a reckless and ignorant hothead who came from a wealthy family. He exposed the truth and slapped his face hard. Who knows if your old man, Wu Lingsu, has met that fire master or lightning goddess? Wu Lingsu can boast however he wants. But I heard that Wu Lingsu came up with a book called Xianxia's Spiritual Treasure Sutra, wanting to cut ties with Mount Longhu and Jingyi School and establish his own sect in Mount Qingcheng, a place with good feng shui. However, there were very few followers. Later, someone recommended Wu Lingsu, saying that your father's Taoist skills were sparse, but his bedroom skills were superb. So, he was called to the palace by His Majesty. Your father was also tactful. He gave him elixirs and secret manuals and even flattered him. He said that there were 9 clouds in the sky, and Xianxia was the highest. The head of Xianxia was the eldest son of the Jade Emperor, who was the reincarnation of the current emperor. His flattery was a bit good, but it was said that several Taoist ancestral halls in Mount Longhu and Wudong all scolded your father, Wu Lingsu, as Great Ox Wu. Even Prince Qingcheng, who occupied the 6th grotto heaven, didn't dare to say a few words back. He's a king, after all. How'd he do it? Yu Wei burst into laughter. Wei Shuyang was very cooperative with His Royal Highness. He pretended to be careful and nervous, and softly corrected him. Young master, Mount Qingcheng is the 5th grotto heaven. Su Fengyin snorted. Isn't the 5th and 6th grotto heaven about the same? Wu Shizhen's expression stiffened, but he still maintained a stiff smile. There was no anger, no irritation. He reached out to stop a female Taoist nun from wiping his sweat. He wiped his own sweat and looked ahead. The roof of the palace could already be vaguely seen. Wu Shizhen, who had never been angered since birth, raised his head and smiled. Young master, we're almost at the Qingyang Palace. Then he instructed one of the slightly older Taoist nun, Qing Shui, walk faster. First, go to the Qingyang Palace and tell them that we have an important guest. The nun twisted her alluring waist and hurried away. Wu Shizhen glanced at Yu Wei, who was holding an ugly girl, from the corner of his eyes. Su Fengyin looked indifferent on the surface. He thought that this young Taoist composure was quite good. Was he really the determined to shut the door and beat the dog? After all, the Qingyang Palace was not the Bailiang army. After being an immortal in Mount Qingcheng for so long, they really thought of themselves as impenetrable immortals. They just didn't know that there were 100 light cavalry at the foot of the mountain. Su Fengyin saw the front hall of the Qingyang Palace from afar. He squinted his eyes and said, Wu Shizhen, does anyone call you Little Bull Wu? Wu Shizhen might have endured a lifetime of hardship, so he didn't mind enduring a little longer. In his heart, he had already scolded this ignorant son of Bailiang 100 times. He was just waiting to enter the Qingyang Palace to teach this guy a lesson. Since he could already see the Qingyang Palace with his father in charge, Wu Shizhen's smile became even brighter. He raised his head and said, Little Bull Wu, this is the first time I've heard of it. Su Fengyin pointed at Shu Xiao in front of him with embroidered clothes. He laughed with Wu Shizhen and said, If there's really a superior bedroom technique that can catch my eye, do you see? This woman is proficient in the art of seduction. She's a little old, but she's familiar with it. I guarantee that a Taoist like you will only envy Mandarin ducks and not immortals. I don't mind giving Aunt Shu to you. We hit it off, and I'm never a stingy person. Shu Xiao's delicate body trembled obviously. Wu Shizhen glanced at Shu Xiao's back. She was indeed a much more beautiful woman than the Taoist women in the palace. Looking at the curve of her body touching the saddle, she was really round. You just enter my Qingyang Palace. You call my father, the Prince of Qingcheng, Wu Lingsu, Big Cowskin Wu, and call me Little Cowskin Wu. Is one stunner enough? What about the rest? It wasn't easy for Su Fengyin to finally see Wu Shizhen's smug look, and he was somewhat impressed. Wang Shizhen's patience and disguise were much better than most of the hedonistic sons of northern Liang. Su Fengyin said to himself, Well, let's enter the Qingyang Palace first. Chapter 124. Wu Shizhen pricked up his ears, but still couldn't hear Su Fengyin's mutterings. Seeing a large number of Taoists pouring out of the Qingyang Palace, he was suddenly filled with pride. He quickened his pace and distanced himself from Su Fengyin, who was carrying 2 blades. Only then did he point to a stone tablet outside the palace and chuckle. On it are the words Duke and Marquis Dismount. It was bestowed by His Majesty the Emperor. Su Fengnian glanced at it and recognized the handwriting. It was indeed written by the emperor. It was the same as the tide-listening pavilion's 9 dragons plaque. It was standard, but there was no charm. Su Fengnian ignored him and urged his horse up the palace. The horse stepped on the white jade steps, the sound of hooves exceptionally crisp. Wei Shuyang followed closely behind. Lu Qiantang and the other 2 followed suit. Especially Lu Qiantang. He was extremely pleased. Duke and Marquis dismount. I, Lu Qiantang, can turn a blind eye to a commoner of a fallen country. Xu Xiao, who was almost handed over to the Qingyang Palace by His Royal Highness, had an ugly expression. The sound of the horse's hooves was particularly heavy. Wu Shizhen didn't stop them. This most gentlemanly son of the Qingshang prince tidied up his headscarf and robe and slowly walked up the steps. All the masters of the Qingyang Palace poured out, no less than 50 people. His father, Wu Lingsu, established the Xianxia sect, which was a glorious start to a sect. In addition, he was conferred the title of king. Although all the Taoists of 9 bushels of rice were driven out, he still attracted many capable people who came because of his fame. Finally, 36 people formed the Xianxia sword formation. Once the formation was activated, the 36 swords whistled and thundered. When he was young, he saw countless old Taoists of 9 bushels of rice from Mount Qingshan come to the Qingyang Palace to reason. They were all defeated by the Wuxia sword formation, which only had 18 people at that time. Now, the Qingyang Palace was unparalleled in Mount Qingshan. The Wuxia sword formation was said to be invincible against those below the 2nd rank, and the Xianxia sword formation could even contend against those below the 1st rank. Wu Shizhen wasn't a frog in a well. He knew that there was a gap between these 2 sword formations and the 3 great sword formations, which had been famous for hundreds of years. However, could this group of people in front of him withstand it? The brawny man with the big sword was a little tricky to deal with. The bodyguard with snow-white hands might also have some strange skills. As for Taoist priest Mi, who was closest to the young master, Wu Shizhen had never taken him seriously. Wu Shizhen, who was confident of victory, was in a difficult position. Translator, transin editor, transin 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 translator, transin editor, transin. Why would Wu Shizhen care about the annual offering of a few hundred taels of silver? These 2 female Taoists were a pair of aunts and nieces. At first, they resisted in every way possible, but after tasting the feeling of cultivating with a sheep and a goat, they were very obedient. Being happy immortals in the Qingyang Palace was much more pleasant and relaxing than being ordinary people at the foot of the mountain. Which secular woman didn't want to be able to retain her youth? His father said that even the imperial concubines couldn't avoid it. There were many ways to distinguish between people and horses. Wu Shizhen only chose the one he was most interested in, which was how to identify dual cultivations, tripod furnaces. He could tell at a glance that this tripod furnace's quality was very good. The one who was ridiculed by Aunt Shu was top grade. The maid in green who drove the carriage and the beautiful maid who only poked her head out once were top grade. The charming woman riding the horse with the black girl in her arms was Celestial's that made people drool. She was second, Celestial's Lotus Bodhisattva. Wu Shizhen was tempted. He wasn't troubled by this Bailiang's retainer Xianxia. He didn't care which Bailiang general's descendant he was. He had the ability to bring thousands of cavalry to Qingsheng, but Yongzhou, which General Gu Jiantang had built into an iron bucket, wouldn't allow Bailiang's soldiers to cross half of the province. We're both military men with outstanding achievements. How could you, Su Xiao, obtain the Pillar State's title and be conferred the title of King of Bailiang? How could I, Gu Jiantang, be only one of the 8 Pillar State? I'm an official in the imperial court, but the military power in my hands is as light as a feather. Wu Shizhen didn't think Gu Jiantang would be so magnanimous as to laugh it off. In the past 10 years, Yongzhou's generals had changed frequently. A third of General Gu's old subordinates had either intentionally or unintentionally been inserted. At the beginning of the year, when his father was drinking, he privately said, Gu Jiantang and Lame Su are going head-to-head. The Gu surname Su is slightly inferior to Lame Su in terms of scheming and strength, but Gu Jiantang is only 43 years old. That's enough. If Su Xiao was so embarrassed, how could a Bailiang's general be so? How could Wu Shizhen be afraid? Moreover, Bailiang's 300,000 cavalry generals were all in the hands of the 6 young adopted sons. He had never heard of any of them having descendants as old as this young man in front of him. Therefore, Wu Shizhen's dilemma was how to distribute the women. How many should he give to his father? Should he hand over the little white cat lady who looked like a bodhisattva and keep the rest for himself? Or should he only take one of the 3,000 women? But would his father, who wholeheartedly wanted to prove his Tao to the world, agree? On Mount Qingsheng, the prince of Qingsheng, Wu Lingsu, was the heavens, and Wu Shizhen was undoubtedly the son of heaven. Whenever Wu Shizhen had a headache, he would habitually roll up the 2 swaying sword belts of the Xiao Yao scarf with his index fingers, dazzling the dozen or so Taoist nuns who had run out of the main hall to join in the fun. The Taoist nuns were infatuated with these little movements of Wu Shizhen's the most. As for in bed, of course they preferred his open and large movements. Compared to the strict rules of dual cultivation with Wu Shizhen's father, where every movement had to be done according to the book, not missing a single step, the Taoist nuns were, without exception, more willing to do it with Wu Shizhen. This little immortal who knew how to dote on others could wave the peach blossom beauty fan, play the suet white jade flute, and play the guqin, causing hundreds of birds to sing in unison. Even the couple who had been kidnapped into the Qingyang Palace were willing to not return home, let alone some female Taoist priests who had been brought up the mountain when they were young. Wu Shizhen looked up at Su Fengyan, who was sitting high on the big jujube horse, and said with a smile, "This horse is mine." Chapter 125. Su Fengyan glanced at the 18 people forming a sword formation and turned to ask Wei Shuyang, "Grandpa Wei, what's the name of this formation?" Wei Shuyang stroked his beard calmly and said, "If I'm not wrong, Wu Lingsu secretly learned a secret formation from Mount Longhu's supreme Elder Pavilion. It's called the Jade Heaven Sword Formation, and it can be said that the student has surpassed the master. Wu Lingsu's talent is outstanding, and even the old celestial master of Mount Longhu admits it. Unfortunately, his heart is not in the right place, and he can't bear hardships. The old celestial master deliberately reprimanded Wu Lingsu and left him on the alchemy rock with the intention of letting the Qingshang prince train his heart. He didn't expect Wu Lingsu to leave Mount Longhu in a fit of anger. His life seems to be glorious, but his cleverness backfired on him. Otherwise, he might have become an external celestial master of Mount Longhu." Su Fengyan smiled and asked, "Let's not talk about the Qingsheng prince." These 18 people formed a sword formation, and the 40 sword-wielding Taoist priests just stood by and watched. Wei Shuyang shook his head solemnly and said, "That's the Qingyang Palace's sword formation. Wu Lingsu calls himself the divine firmament heavenly lord, so he has some confidence. I don't know how he came up with a set of 36 heavenly firmament sword formation, and its power is not to be underestimated. At least I don't dare to take it lightly. I'll most likely lose or even die. It's one of the most famous formations now. The busybodies close to the Qingyang Palace have been promoting it, saying that it's as powerful as the 3 great sword formations. 3 years ago, Wu Lingsu entered the palace again and brought the 36 sword-wielding Taoist priests with him. It said that outside the Hall of Illustrious Talents, the sword light shone brightly. It was a sunny day, but it suddenly turned into thunder, competing with the sun and moon. Some even said that celestial master Zhao, who was watching from the side, lost his color. Su Fengyan sneered, "I believe that the divine firmament sword formation is not weak, but I don't believe that the second celestial master of Mount Longhu cried out in fear. Old Huang told me about the 3 great sword formations, but he said he had never been to the Wu family sword tomb. Mount Longhu's sword formation is undoubtedly the best in the world. The second celestial master is a glutton who has eaten all kinds of delicacies. He would at most say that it's not bad. This is Wu Lingsu, who is the best at creating momentum, trying to blow her own trumpet. The Qingyang palaces of Wudao's sword formation was 100 sword-wielding sword formation. The Taiji sword formation of Wudong Mountain had 81 peachwood swordsmen. It was said that they could multiply and multiply endlessly. Their sword momentum was like rolling clouds. As long as the central swordsman did not die, none of them would die. They had never tasted defeat. The Wu family's sword tomb boasted that only 9 withered swords could defeat 10,000 cavalry. This was just a ridiculous legend. 200 years ago, 9 of the Wu family's swordsmen left the tomb to save 1 person. The 9 of them went to Beimeng with 9 horses and 9 swords. The 9 of them risked their lives to defeat 10,000 of Beimeng's most elite ghost back heavy armor. It was unknown whether this was true or not, but more than half of the 9 were injured. In the end, only 3 of them returned to the Wu family. The sword tomb's vitality was greatly damaged. The carriage stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Jiang and I and the old god of swords got off the carriage. Jiang and I, who feared ghosts and gods, was very careful. He was afraid that lightning would strike down from the sky. That Su Fengyan had committed a heinous crime. It was hard to guarantee that he would not attract the wrath of the deities on Mount Qingqing. The book said that the more famous the mountain or river, the more one should not speak loudly for fear of startling the deities. Wasn't this the reason? If he was implicated by Su Fengyan, Jiang and I felt that his death would be too unjust. He had committed countless sins, but he was a good person who would leave food for the hungry rats in that leaky hut in Bailiang. He was bitten by mosquitoes in the summer and couldn't sleep, but he didn't dare to kill them. He could only endure the heat and tightly wrap himself in the sheets. The one-armed old god of swords saw that Jiang and I would look up from time to time. His expression would change when he saw the clouds floating over his head. He couldn't help but tease, "Little Jiang, what are you afraid of?" This old man said that even if lightning strikes down, he can break it with 1 sword. It won't hurt you at all. Therefore, you can beg for the sky to change and the clouds to roll. It would be best if you could strike that evil man, Su Fengyan, to death. Jiang and I stood on the stone steps and chose a spot furthest away from Su Fengyan. He didn't dare to go forward. He said gloomily, "But you don't even have a sword." The leader of the older generation smiled conceitedly and said, "That day on the muddy path, this old man took a small umbrella and casually used 1 sword immortal kneeling." To this old man, is there anything in the world that can't be used as a sword? It's just that as long as he hasn't really held a sword, this old man doesn't have the thought of taking back half of the wooden horse ox. Naturally, he also doesn't have the peak sword will of the past. This is the agreement this old man made with Butcher before he walked out of the tide-listening pavilion. It can't be easily broken. Little Jiang, do you know the origin of that 1 sword immortal kneeling? Jiang and I was constantly on guard against the sky. He took the time to look at the square where swords were drawn and bows were drawn. As expected, he said, "I don't want to know." The old god of swords rolled his eyes. Su Fengyan and Wei Shuyang were talking very loudly just now. Wu Shizhen heard them clearly. He crossed the square and retreated to the door of the main hall. He smiled and shouted, "You'll know if the 2 sword formations of the Qingyang Palace live up to their name." Su Fengyan laughed and said, "Not at all. I didn't bring enough people with me this time. The Qingyang Palace is the residence of immortals. Let's not fight and hurt the harmony. I'm here for immortality. I'll say it again. If you teach me the art of immortality, I'll give the Qingyang Palace thousands of pounds of gold. If you don't, you can teach me the art of sexual intercourse. You don't have to worry about Aunt Shu. I have countless of such goods in my residence. As long as the Qingyang Palace is lucky enough to form a relationship with me, I'll send them to you every year." Wu Shizhen, whose patience had reached its limit, finally shed all pretense of cordiality. He said gloomily, "Did you see the words Duke and Marquis dismount? I've reminded you that riding on a horse is a crime punishable by death. Su Fengnian said in a puzzled tone. Oh. Wu Shizhen pointed at Shu Xiu, Yu Wei, Bluebird, and Jiang Ni, who was furthest away. If you're willing to hand over these 4 people, I'll not only exempt you from the death penalty for riding on a horse, I'll also give you a few secret manuals of dual cultivation. I'll even let my father teach you the art of immortality. How about it? Su Fengnian said with a smile. Lu Qiantang, go break the formation.